Climbing out of the fissure, the two of them, and the ominous figure of the Sin of Solace, studied the calm surface of the great river. By now, it seemed like a sea of blood. The patch of red water surrounding the dead behemoth was growing larger as it was slowly washed away. Just then, an ominous shadow moved through the blood, and a giant, cloudy eye rose from the red liquid to stare at them with hatred and burning malice. Sunny shivered and felt the desire to take a step back. Nephis remained unmoved. After a while, she spoke in a somber tone and added,
Strong.
He sighed.
It's a great beast, and of course, it's strong.
At that moment, the Sin of Solace smiled, as they escaped the suffocating gaze of the Azure Serpent by jumping back into the fissure. The sword wraith spoke.
Isn't it just a great beast? Where is your fighting spirit, Sunny? Go, kill it like you always do.
Sunny threw an irritated glance at him and thought, Shut the hell up. The apparition laughed. Why? Can't I make a joke? Of course. A pathetic waste of a divine aspect like you has no hope of surviving a fight with this creature. It grinned and added, That's why it's funny. Sunny frowned and glared at the Sin of Solace, then started to think of a response. However, at that moment, Neph's voice distracted him from the conversation.
Sunny, who are you talking to?
Startled, he flinched slightly and turned to her. His face grew slightly more pale than usual.
You heard that? I spoke it aloud.
She lingered for a moment, then nodded. Sunny let out a small laugh and scratched his head, feigning embarrassment. In truth, he was a little frightened. It seems that the effect of the Sin of Solace on his mind wasn't as tame as he had thought, and he cursed under his breath.
That, my primary weapon memory has a peculiar enchantment. Basically, it's a voice that doesn't miss a chance to explain how wrong everything I do is, right, something like that.
Nephis stared at him for a while, and then a hint of a smile appeared on her face.
Wait, why are you smiling? It's very annoying.
She simply shook her head.
It's nothing. I was just suddenly reminded of an old fairy tale I once heard.
He gave her a dubious look.
Really? What's that fairy tale about?
Nephis pondered for a bit, as if trying to recall, then said with uncertainty.
It's about a mischievous doll who ran away from home. Every time the doll lied, his nose would grow bigger, and there was a cricket who followed the wooden boy around, trying to explain what's right and what's wrong to him.
Sunny blinked a couple of times, perplexed. What kind of weird story was that? And why would a doll be alive? Was it actually an echo, or a nightmare creature? He frowned.
That's one strange fairy tale. I do see why you would remember it, though not that I've any problems with the length of my nose, so how does it end?
Nephis thought for a while.
I guess the doll learns how to be a good boy and returns home with the cricket. That's not the original ending, though.
Sunny felt a little better about himself after hearing that. Curious, he raised an eyebrow and asked,
Yeah, what happens to the doll in the original then?
He kills the cricket with a hammer, then gets hanged from a tree and dies.
Sunny's eyes twitched. Lowering himself to the ground, he scoffed and asked,
What the hell? That doesn't even make sense. Isn't that doll made of wood? Why would he die after being hanged from a tree? Ridiculous, not to mention that a talking wooden doll would have been at least a demon. There's no way a demon would die from being hanged. Anyway, that memory of mine has grown stronger once we entered the nightmare. I've a couple of ideas why, but I'm not certain yet, so that peculiar enchantment has become more annoying, too. I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't mind me.
However, he couldn't help but glance at the Sin of Solace and add with a bit of venom in his voice.
As for the fairy tale, now that we established that the doll wouldn't have died from hanging, I must admit, I wouldn't mind smashing that annoying cricket with a hammer and watching it die.
The apparition mockingly raised an eyebrow. Neph, meanwhile, frowned slightly and asked,
Why do you keep looking to the side when talking about that enchantment?
Well, at first there was only a voice, but now there's an illusory figure following me too. In fact, it looks exactly like me and uses my own voice to berate me. It's fine, though just annoying.
Nephis remained silent before asking in an even tone.
So, there are two Sunnies here right now.
Sunny grimaced, then nodded with a bit of reluctance.
In a sense, one is just a foul-mouthed hallucination, though.
Neph stared at him for a while with a funny expression. Then, she tilted her head slightly and stared at him some more. Sunny suddenly felt a bit weird under that gaze.
Why are you looking at me like that? I am not crazy.
No, what was it hidden in the depths of her calm gray eyes? Was it amusement? Nephis suddenly took a deep breath and then shook her head.
I know that you aren't crazy. That memory should be the sin of solace, right? It's tied to Ariel and therefore to the tomb of Ariel. Even though the pyramid doesn't seem to exist in this nightmare, it might come in handy.
Sunny slowly exhaled and conceded.
Right.
Nephis had access to the list of his memories, so she would know about the sin of solace, but that reminded him. Growing serious, Sunny said in a somber tone,
Speaking of which, I think we should try to figure out where we are and, more importantly, why we are here. I think that if we pull all the information we have together, we might be able to find out a few things.
She nodded.
Okay, I was thinking the same thing. There have to be hints in the descriptions of some of the memories we received during the chain of nightmares. I can tell you which ones of mine seem important.
Sunny too thought that this was the best course of action, at least for now. The Azure Serpent didn't seem to have plans of climbing onto the carcass of the black turtle, and the current was pulling it downstream. Even if they tried to fly away, their speed wouldn't be much greater than that of the Dark Island. So, they might as well try to better understand the situation first. However, he gathered his willpower, hesitated for a few moments, and forced out an indifferent smile.
Before that, I think you should summon a new armor memory, so you know this one could restore itself.
Nephis frowned, then looked down at herself. The black garments she wore were singed and torn, revealing more than a fair bit of her smooth alabaster skin. She remained motionless for a bit, then shifted slightly. Turn R, can you turn around? She phrased it as a question instead of a request, but Sunny nevertheless obediently faced the wall of the fissure and answered, I can. After a moment of awkward silence, another question followed.
Can you also make your shadow turn around?
No problem.
He forced the gloomy shadow to face the black rock, too.
You're a pitiful man, Sunny, you know that. Don't bother responding. Gods, I wish you did squish me with a hammer, then I wouldn't have to endure your...
Sunny ignored him. Soon, the dark fissure became a little brighter. Neph's clothes turned into a swarm of white sparks. Then, the fissure was illuminated again as she summoned another armor. Sunny let out a shaky breath and asked, Are you done?
What's this sense of déjà vu?
She answered after a short pause, Yeah. He smiled and said, All right, let's do some research then. If you want the next episode to find you, you should subscribe, that's all. Nephis changed from her torn clothes and was now wearing a white tunic with its hems embroidered in intricate red patterns. The tunic was somewhat similar to Sunny's Shroud of Dusk, but also different. It seemed like a single sheet of light fabric that had been elaborately tied at the shoulders, and thus had no sleeves, loosely fastened at the waist and with high slits. It seemed like something that could afford one a high degree of freedom of movement. Still, Sunny was slightly surprised to see what Neph had chosen to summon. She gave him a strange look, and he asked, What? He shrugged.
I just imagined that you would select a suit of steel armor, or at least something that offers more protection. There has to be a memory like that among those that summer night gave you, right?
But what does it matter here? No matter how powerful of an armor memory I use, it'll still break after brushing against a great abomination once, so I might as well go for something light and offering good utility. This tunic might not protect me well, but it enhances my senses. For now, that's more important, best of all. As she slightly pursed her lips and added with a hint of frustration in her voice, it won't burn.
All right, and suit yourself.
It wasn't like he had anything to complain about. That tunic of hers was rather beautiful. Plus, he wasn't one to talk, considering what he himself was wearing. Sonny pulled his gaze away from Neff's slender figure and stared at the memories that were laying on the ground between them. These were all the ones in their possession that mentioned Ariel, his tomb, the great river, or an estuary of any kind. There was no real need to summon them, since both Sonny and Nephis could see each other's runes. However, having something to look at was more convenient. They were a beautifully engraved chalice of white stone full of black liquid, a hand mirror of dark silver that gave off an ominous feeling, a graceful giant with a long and slender blade of pristine white jade, a necklace of engraved black metal that resembled a collar, an elegant mallet with a hammerhead made of perfectly black stone, a dagger made of cloudy steel with a handle that was wrapped in black leather, the bitter cusp, the mirror of truth, the sin of solace, the stifled scream, the dark shaper and the falling ash. The last two came from Nephis, while all the other ones came from Sonny. He had spent more time in Antarctica, after all, and received more memories from the abominations of the chain of nightmares. There was also the shroud of graceless dusk, but Sonny didn't feel like undressing, although it might have been only fair for him to do so, so he muttered, "Never mind." He studied the memories for a while, sometimes glancing at the shimmering runes in front of him. Eventually, Sonny said,
Before we try to draw any conclusions, let's go over what we already know first.
Nephis nodded. Sonny took a deep breath.
First of all, there was a demon called Ariel, the demon of dread. The tomb of Ariel stands somewhere in the nightmare desert. However, it's not a tomb where Ariel is buried, rather, it's a tomb that he built.
He remained silent for a moment, then continued.
The seven of us entered a seed of nightmare that seemed to have originated from the tomb of Ariel. However, instead of being transported into the past of the nightmare desert, we somehow ended up in the middle of a strange and boundless river.
It wasn't certain that the great river was boundless. Sonny hadn't tried to reach its seemingly unattainable shores yet. After all, however, it was definitely incredibly vast. He frowned.
That river seems to be the Great River, which is said to exist outside of time and flow endlessly from the future into the past. Whatever that means, the Great River is connected to the tomb of Ariel somehow, but we don't know how exactly.
After finishing, Sonny lingered a bit and then asked, "Anything you want to add?"
The nightmare we entered is an abnormal one. The vision of the reverse time was interrupted. Additionally, there are supposed to be millions of challengers within it, apart from that. She glanced at the strange sky of the great river, where dawn coexisted with dusk and day, and at the seven suns bathing the world in light. Then Nephis said, "This place looks like a colossal soul sea."
Sonny's eyes glistened.
Right, and that was what I thought as well.
He sighed and then picked up the dagger forged out of cloudy steel, the falling ash, weighing it in his hand. Sonny glanced at its complicated weave and then turned to the runes, memory, falling ash, memory rank. At the same time, Nephis looked at his own memories for a while and then tentatively picked up the mirror of truth. She glanced at her reflection, shivered, then turned the mirror around and studied the beautiful engravings on its back. Her eyes darted from side to side, most likely reading the runes that described the meeting between Weaver and Ariel. After a few moments, a contemplative expression appeared on Neff's face.
This one is interesting. I think it's important. It can help us understand the nature and purpose of the tomb of Ariel. However, it doesn't tell us anything about the Great River.
She put the mirror of truth aside and reached out for the bitter cusp.
This one is connected to the sin of Solace and the falling ash, I think.
Sonny nodded as he read the description of the ashen dagger. The runes read, Ariel built a beautiful palace of jade for the queen, and there she held her court. A great bridge of stone led to the jade palace, covered in snow and ash. Soon, the news of the queen's beauty and wisdom spread across the realms, and many guests came to witness her grace. Not all of them survived the snow, and even fewer survived the ash. Still, more and more came. He frowned. The description of the sin of Solace told of a beautiful monster that Ariel had made a queen and gifted with the sinister knowledge of hideous truth. The description of the bitter cusp told the eerie story of a group of guests that came to the Jade Court with ill intentions. And this one told about how Ariel had built the Jade Court, the Jade Palace, for the Jade Queen. None of that information was particularly useful for them now, except maybe for the fact that Ariel seemed fond of building things. However, Sonny glanced at Nephis and showed her the dagger.
That Jade Palace, doesn't it sound like Ravenheart?
Ravenheart, the great citadel of Clan Song, was situated among snowy peaks and raging volcanoes. Snow and ash were always falling there, and more than that, one had to cross an enormous stone bridge to reach it. The description of the Jade Palace was too similar. Neph looked at the falling ash. Then, her eyes glinted a little as she admitted, "It does." Sonny was a bit stunned. He had learned some time ago that the citadels of the great clans were left behind by the 7 demons, and were thus very important to the sovereigns. So were the Ivory Tower, which had once belonged to Hope, and the Hollow Mountains, where Nether's citadel still remained undiscovered. That was why Valor and Song had been racing to conquer the tomb of Ariel. But if the citadel left behind by Ariel was actually Ravenheart, then which demon was tied to the Black Pyramid? Who could be more connected to the tomb of Ariel than its builder? Feeling confused, Sonny shook his head and tried to concentrate on the task at hand. Right now, they had to learn about the Great River the most, because that was where they were stuck. Putting the falling ash back, he picked up the Dark Shaper, which looked like an elegant mallet with its head made of perfectly black stone. In fact, that black stone looked very familiar. Sonny studied the weave of the black mallet, then glanced at its runes. A few moments later, his eyes widened. The Dark Shaper was a transcendent memory of the 4th tier that Nephis had gained in Antarctica. It was one of the few she had chosen to keep. The rest either went to the Firekeepers or were sold to acquire various equipment and resources. Being the leader of a group of elite awakened wasn't cheap. Even with the support of Clan Valor, Neph had to work hard to provide her followers with the best, everything. Perhaps it was a part of the King of Swords testing her competency, or perhaps the Great Clan simply didn't care to spend too much on the survivors of the Forgotten Shore before they proved themselves. In any case, Nephis had decided to keep the Dark Shaper for herself. The reason she had decided to hold on to the stone mallet was both because of its power and because its description mentioned the Demon of Dread. The Dark Shaper looked more like a tool than a weapon. It had a handle of dark polished wood inlaid with dull silver. The hammerhead was fashioned out of perfectly black stone, which looked and felt rather familiar. Sonny was almost certain that it was the same stone that the tomb of Ariel had been built of. The stone mallet's enchantments had to do with sculpting and changing the shape of things. Disturbingly, these things weren't limited to stone, metal, and wood. If one wished, they could also shape flesh and bone, sculpting all kinds of nightmarish creations. The sinister, corrupted devil Nephis had killed to receive the Dark Shaper was similarly revolting. It was indeed a memory worthy of being graced with the name of the Demon of Dread in its description. And speaking of the description, at first, Sonny simply studied the shimmering runes, finding them rather interesting. They read, Memory Dark Shaper, Memory Rank, Transcendent, Memory Tier 4, Memory Type, Tool, Memory Description. When the unholy titan took a step, everyone cowered in fear. Only Ariel, the Demon of Dread, remained standing. He didn't feel fear, for he was fear itself. Taking a step forward, he challenged the unholy titan, and the two battled under the azure sky. Their battle was fierce. Their battle was fearsome. Their battle was a hint of the doom that would come. The unholy titan possessed an indestructible stone body and was invulnerable to all harm. As they fought, the land was shattered and the sky split apart. The demon of dread received many harrowing wounds, but the terrible titan remained wholly unscathed. Its stone body became incandescent from the heat, shining brighter than the fiery sun. That was when the demon of dread whispered something to his enemy, and then cast the titan into the depths of the ocean. When the incandescent titan plunged into the cool water, the ocean turned into searing vapor and was scattered by the winds. The stone flesh of the titan instantly cooled, causing a tiny crack to appear on its heart. That tiny spot was the only part of the creature that hadn't been tempered, and was also its only flaw. As Ariel watched coldly, the titan bellowed in agony after one heartbeat. Cracks appeared on its indestructible body after 2 heartbeats. Blood flowed from its wounds like a river. After 3 heartbeats, its body started to crumble into numerous shards, and on the 7th heartbeat, its heart shattered, turning into dust. That was how the unholy stone titan was destroyed. Following the end of the battle, the demon of dread created a mystical river out of the titan's blood and built a pyramid out of its stone flesh. The pyramid stood where the ocean had once been. The description ended. It was after he finished reading that Sonny's eyes widened as an unbelievable guess appeared in his mind. Wait, no way. The tale of Ariel's battle with an unholy titan was indeed very interesting, not the least because it seemed as though the demon of dread had won due to a single whisper. More than that, it hinted at the answers to several questions that Sonny had been curious about. For example, who or what was the progenitor of the minor shard of the stone titan, Goliath, or how the nightmare desert had come into existence. But these precious pieces of knowledge weren't what caused such a reaction from Sonny. What drew his attention was the abrupt end of the description. Didn't it seem incomplete? As if there was another part of it missing. Coincidentally, he knew of another description that seemed like a fragment of a larger whole. Frowning, Sonny summoned his own runes and found the name of the stifled scream. Concentrating on it, he read. Memory description. A great river was contained within it, flowing endlessly from the future into the past. When doom came, many entered to seek shelter from it, and many had come to seek the truth. That was because the great river existed outside time, and so, it was said that a dreadful secret was hidden at its estuary. Few of those capable dared to approach it, and none of those who had returned. He remained motionless for a few moments, then mentally put the 2 descriptions together.
Following the end of the battle, the demon of dread created a mystical river out of the titan's blood and built a pyramid out of its stone flesh. The pyramid stood where the ocean had once been. A great river was contained within it, flowing endlessly from the future into the past.
His hands trembled, unable to speak. Sonny turned his head slightly and stared at Nephis. A few moments later, she noticed his gaze and raised an eyebrow, asking, "What?" He lingered for a while, and then said hesitantly,
I am really not sure, but I think I understand where we are now. Neph, this might sound crazy, but I think that we are inside the Black Pyramid.
The 2 of them climbed from the fissure and stood gazing at the 7 suns moving across the vast sky. They remained silent for a while. Eventually, Sonny spoke, his voice carrying a sense of wonder and perplexity.
I know that it doesn't make sense, but it also makes so much sense, you know.
Nephis frowned, her thoughts mirroring his. She had read both descriptions, and although Sonny's theory sounded outlandish, it was also compelling in a bizarre and irrational way. He took a deep breath and continued to unravel his theory.
I mean, listen, we were in the nightmare desert and entered the 3rd nightmare through a seed that had been a part of Ariel's tomb once. Logically, the spell should have sent us into the past of the desert, or at least into the past of the Black Pyramid. However, it sent us into the Great River instead. That's an obvious contradiction.
Sonny brushed his hair back and rubbed his eyes, attempting to make sense of the puzzle.
But it all makes sense if the Great River is actually situated inside the pyramid. Sure, no matter how large the pyramid is, it can't be large enough to contain an entire region of the dream realm, an entire world. Even, that's if we think about it from the perspective of human logic. However, Ariel wasn't a human, he was a demon, an actual deity. Beings like that aren't bound by mundane logic. If he could create a pyramid that doesn't draw nearer no matter how long you walk toward it, who says that he couldn't create a pyramid that contains a whole world inside it?
Nephis considered the implications of Sunny's words. Her eyes remained fixed on the vast Great River and the Azure Serpent lurking beneath its surface, with madness and hunger in its gaze, struggling to ignore the unsettling presence of the serpent. She sighed and voiced her own insights.
Did he create that world too, then? Well, now that I think about it, he might have. Both of us thought that this place looked like a soul sea, right? Maybe it's not a soul sea, but instead was made from one. Ariel built the black pyramid out of the flesh of an unholy titan. He created the great river out of its blood. Then he created a world out of its soul, if so. Then those 7 suns were made out of 7 divine soul shards that the Titan had left behind.
Nephis paused for a moment and then added, her voice tinged with a sense of awe.
If the humans of the Forgotten Shore could create an artificial sun, there's really no reason why Ariel couldn't create 7 better ones.
Sunny acknowledged her insights with a nod.
It would also explain why there are no stars in the night sky and why it's entirely black, because it's not a real sky. Instead, the black pyramid is hollow, and what we're looking at is actually the inner side of its walls.
The two of them exchanged glances, growing more convinced that their startling theory was right. Troubled, Nephis looked at the 7 suns again and expressed her concerns.
So Ariel created this place, this tomb, to bury the truths he couldn't endure, and there's said to be a dreadful secret hidden in its estuary. It's easy to conclude that the truth he buried and the dreadful secret are one and the same. However, isn't it a little bit too elaborate of a feat to create a whole world, hide it within an indestructible pyramid, and remove it from the natural flow of time, all just to hide a secret? Why would he want to go to all that trouble?
Sunny listened to her with a somber expression on his face. He remained silent for a bit, then speculated about Ariel's motives.
Maybe it's not that he wanted to, but instead that he had no other choice. The truth is hidden in the estuary of the Great River, and the Great River flows from the future into the past. But what's its estuary, actually? What can be the end of a river that flows through time, into the past?
Sunny paused, deep in thought, and then arrived at a peculiar conclusion.
The only end such a river can have is the point, when time didn't exist yet, isn't it? Where the past terminates. The estuary of the Great River has to be the point where the past disappears into the primordial void, which was everlasting and ever-changing, and existed before the concepts like death and time were even created by the gods. In fact, the estuary has to exist before the gods were born, and therefore outside their control. If Ariel wanted to hide something from even the gods, wouldn't he have had to go to such lengths?
Nephis sighed, then rubbed her face, grappling with the paradoxical nature of these revelations.
This is a little bit too strange to think about, a time before time existed. That's a paradox in and of itself, don't you think? Also, the Great River doesn't only flow from the future into the past, it also does so endlessly. How can an endless river reach a point of termination?
Sunny felt a headache coming on, and he grimaced as he looked away.
Well, anyway, regardless of all that, at least we know now that the Sibyls didn't literally hide inside a huge pyramid with their people. They actually came to the Great River, which existed outside the natural flow of time, and was thus far removed from the doom that they were escaping. That doom, it had to be the war between the demons and the gods, right? That was why they eventually couldn't hear the voices of the gods anymore, because the gods died.
Nephis slowly nodded, prompting Sunny to smile with an air of revelation.
You do understand what it means, don't you?
She looked at him with a hint of curiosity as he asked, "What exactly are you talking about?" He grinned with a sense of anticipation.
It means that there are tons of locals here on the Great River. We just haven't found them yet, but when we do, we'll be able to learn all kinds of information from them, including what the central conflict of this nightmare is and how to conquer it.
She tilted her head a little, intrigued by his optimism.
And there have to be plenty of humans here, according to the descriptions of the memories. It's just that they had entered the Great River much earlier than we did, so they're probably somewhere further downstream, further into the past.
Without having to say anything, both of them turned to look north, in the direction where the waters of the Great River were flowing. The view was rather beautiful, except for the terrifying silhouette of the ancient serpent, which had raised its neck from the water and was devouring them with its eyes. Nephis lingered for a while, and then said in a low voice, a tinge of worry in her tone,
But Sonny, what if the goal of this nightmare is to reach the estuary? What are we going to do then?
He shivered, startled by her question. The idea of reaching the end of the Great River was both daunting and overwhelming. Surely, a third nightmare wouldn't have such an insane goal. That wasn't a task for mere Ascended. There had to be something else, something more attainable, something they could accomplish. He just didn't know what it was. Sonny let out a stifled laugh.
Let's hope that it's not, and if it's, well, I guess we'll have to do our best.
The Sin of Solace smirked as he looked at the water, the mysteries of the Great River and the tomb of Ariel unfolding before them, as they journeyed deeper into the enigmatic third nightmare. So, this is it, then. The tomb of Ariel had been built from the remains of the stone titan, while the great river created from its blood was contained within it, illuminated by the 7 suns made from its broken soul cores. The secret hidden at the estuary was the truth that Ariel had wished to forget. The nightmare desert was the result of the battle between him and the unholy creature. Looking at the blue sky above them, Sonny couldn't help but wonder. So the demons were capable of creating artificial worlds. Then, a sudden thought made him shiver. What's the difference between a real world and an artificial one, though? Was there even a difference? And if there wasn't, had the rest of the worlds been created by someone as well? The demons, the gods, the unknown. He sighed, then shook his head. Do I really have time to ponder the cosmic origins of the world? Right now, they had more practical questions to answer. Many of the mysteries of the third nightmare had been revealed to them, but many more remained. At least they now knew where they were, and what their next step had to be. Travel downstream, find the Sibley's, and learn how to conquer this seed. Well, that's easier said than done, though. Sonny stared at the waters of the great river and saw the sharp blades of the Azure Serpent's dorsal fin break its surface as the Great Abomination hungrily circled the corpse of the titanic turtle. A dark expression appeared on his face. After a bit of silence, he said,
Neph, do you think we can kill this thing?
It's not impossible. This beast is 2 whole ranks above us, which would usually mean that there's no hope. But then again, we did eventually kill a few fallen abominations as sleepers back on the forgotten shore. Nephis grew silent for a moment and then added somberly, However, the gap between ranks grows much wider the higher those ranks are. The difference between a corrupted creature and a fallen one is much greater than the difference between a fallen creature and an awakened one, while the gap between a great abomination and a corrupted one is even greater still. Worse yet, this great beast is in its natural element in the water, while we aren't. My aspect will also be weakened there. In the depths.
Glaring at the serpent intensely, Sunny slowly nodded. Everything she said was reasonable.
I bet I can still kill it, though.
Hearing his unexpected words, Nephis chuckled, but Sunny was serious. He wasn't particularly confident, but he also didn't think that their chances were close to zero. Both of them were strong, and they were even stronger together. There were his shadows, and the powerful memories they possessed. Most importantly, the Azure Serpent was a mere beast. No matter how harrowing its power was, it lacked intelligence, while Sunny was full of all kinds of devious schemes. With Nephis trailing not far behind, the odds were perilous, but not impossible indeed.
But maybe we won't need to gamble with our lives. There might not be a need to fight it at all.
He lingered for a while, then nodded. She was right. Their current goal was to travel downstream, far into the past, and find those humans who had escaped the war between the gods and the demons by entering the tomb of Ariel, the corpse of the great monster they were using as shelter. Meanwhile, was being slowly dragged in that same direction by the current. The titanic carcass of the black turtle was like a ship that could very well take them all the way to their destination. Since that was the case, there was no reason to battle the Azure Serpent or anything at all, of course. Things could change for the worse at any moment. The future was unclear, and there was no way to tell what would happen. No, wait, since we are moving downstream, wouldn't it be the past that's unclear? My head hurts. Sunny sighed and glanced at Nephis.
What do we do then? What's our next move?
She looked up. The 7 suns were already starting to drown in the radiant waters of the great river, and the dawn of the eastern horizon was slowly fading into the pitch blackness of the night. Nephis lowered her gaze.
We should probably rest and take another look at the situation in the morning with fresh eyes. I don't know about you, but I am thoroughly exhausted. I haven't slept in a long while, and the battle between the turtle and the snake took a lot out of me.
Sunny smiled crookedly. He was tired, too. He hadn't done anything in the last couple of days except drift through the sky, but as it turned out, doing nothing was very exhausting, especially when one was suspended between the surface of a mystical river and the sky, having to keep an eye on both lest some terrible creature swallow them whole in one bite.
Yeah, I am tired too.
Some time later, the two of them were hidden from the wind and the piercing gaze of the ancient serpent and the familiar fissure on the shell of the dead behemoth. There was a small fire burning between them, casting shadows on the black rock. The shadows were dancing. There weren't a lot of things on the dark island that could be used as fuel, but Sunny had a few bricks of compressed synthetic firewood stored in the covetous coffer, once again. His loyal alloy chest had come in handy. Sadly, it was already almost empty. Nephis made a dish from some of Sunny's last provisions, and the two of them enjoyed a late supper as the world was slowly consumed by darkness. The soft glow of the water wasn't visible from inside the fissure, and it seemed as though nothing at all existed outside the small circle illuminated by the fire anymore. There were no stars in the black sky, and so Sunny couldn't help but remember a similar night from many years ago, when Nephis and he had first met on the forgotten shore and shared a conversation in the dark. Gods, almost 4 years had passed since then, hadn't they? A small smile appeared on his face.
Hey, do you remember how you told me about the adventures of Odysseus?
Nephis looked up from her food and hesitated for a moment. A distant expression appeared on her beautiful face as he asked, "Sure, why?" Sunny shook his head and shoved a spoonful of the fragrant, thick soup into his mouth.
No, nothing. That Odysseus guy, I don't think he had gone through half the crap we had to go through, though.
A faint smile appeared on Neff's face. She stared into the fire for a while, then leaned her back against the weathered black rock with a shrug.
Who can tell? There are a lot of stories about the trials and tribulations he had to endure.
Bathed in the warmth of the fire and with his belly pleasantly full, Sunny felt his body and mind relax. Throwing a curious glance at her, he asked,
What's your favorite story about that guy, then?
Nephis remained silent for a while with a look of contemplation on her face, which was cast in shadows, with only its vague silhouette visible in the darkness, and the dancing white sparks that shone in the depths of her eyes. Eventually, she said,
Maybe it's not a favorite, but I often think about one of them in particular.
Sunny raised an eyebrow and asked, "Which one?" Neff sighed quietly before answering.
Odysseus was a great hero of Hellas, but he wasn't the greatest one. The greatest and most powerful hero was named Heracles, who was a demigod and a slayer of monsters. Heracles possessed incredible strength and performed many incredible feats. After he died, the gods took his soul to the heavenly realm, where he became an immortal god himself. She grew quiet for a moment. However, Odysseus once descended into the underworld, where he saw the shadows of the dead. Among them was the forlorn shadow of Heracles. So, when I was a child, I always wondered how Heracles could both be a god and a lost shadow in the land of the dead.
Nephis shifted slightly and moved her hand, causing the fire to suddenly burn brighter.
I asked my grandmother, and she explained that one part of Heracles was divine, while another part of him was human. It was the divine part of Heracles that ascended to godhood, while the human part was cast down into the underworld, doomed to wander its dark halls forever.
Her voice was a little wistful. Sunny frowned and gave her a dark look.
That's a little messed up.
Neph smiled.
I also always thought that it was very unfair for the gods to simply discard the human part of Heracles, hypocritical even.
She lingered for a few moments and shrugged.
Of course, when I grew older, I realized that it was really just two different versions of the myth colliding with each other. The stories of Odysseus are older, and so Heracles, despite being the greatest of heroes, had a tragic death in those ancient myths. The version of his own stories that we know are newer, and the original ending was changed to a happier one at some point, with the added lesson, be a valiant hero, and you shall be rewarded, something like that.
When she finished talking, Sunny suddenly chuckled. His eye glinted in the dark.
So little Neph thought that the gods were hypocrites. I see now, turns out, your disdain for the figures of authority goes very far back.
A corner of her mouth twisted up as she conceded. I guess it does.
No wonder she's dead set on killing the sovereigns and destroying the spell. This hopeless lunatic was like that from the very start.
Sunny hesitated for a while, then asked.
Don't you think that it's a little hypocritical too, though? You're a great figure of authority yourself now. After all, Lady Changing Star of the Immortal Flame, the torchbearer of humanity and the idol of millions of people, both mundane and awakened, seems like a contradiction.
Nephis looked at him across the fire with a neutral expression. The sparks of white light in her eyes danced as she answered.
Humans are contradictory creatures. They can wage genocidal wars in the name of pacifist religions, tell truths to deceive each other. They can even love and hate something or someone at the same time.
Looking away, she shrugged and smiled.
I was a very reasonable child, and I often tried to understand people through reason, to no success whatsoever, of course. It was only after I learned that people are inherently unreasonable that I started to understand them a little. I am a person too. It's no surprise that I am a bit contradictory as well.
Sunny stared at her silently. After a while, he scoffed.
Really? Because, let me tell you, I was a very unreasonable child.
Nephis looked at him in surprise when he asked, seriously. He nodded energetically.
Yes, one might even say that I was a bit dumb, trying to understand things through reason. Couldn't be me, I just learned things through trial and error.
Sunny paused for a moment and then added somberly, well, mostly error. Nephis tilted her head a little and then suddenly smiled.
To be honest, I can't really imagine you as a child. I just always imagine you as you. What were you like?
He scratched the back of his head with a bit of embarrassment.
Well, if I remember correctly, I was very gentle and kind, to a fault. Even, do you know how kids would sometimes pull the wings off annoying insects? I would never, in fact, I would cry for a day straight if I accidentally killed a spider or a fly.
His face slowly turned grim.
Well, that didn't last long, though, so I was mostly a weird and wicked child, I guess. Still, it was better than being soft and naive.
Then, Sunny looked at Nephis in confusion.
What? Why are you looking at me like that?
She blinked a couple of times.
Pulling the wings off insects. What? Is it really a thing children do?
He coughed.
Right. I forgot that Neph grew up incredibly sheltered because of all the assassination attempts. Had she even met someone her age before coming to the academy?
Sunny awkwardly looked away.
Maybe it's just a boy thing or an outskirts thing. I don't know, really. Not everyone does it, but some kids do. Well, I've no idea. I didn't.
Neph remained silent for a while, then said thoughtfully,
Maybe they're playing awakened and pretending to slay nightmare creatures. Yes, that makes sense. Still, it's a bit cruel.
The conversation had taken a strange turn, and Sunny was feeling a little uncomfortable. The fire was dying down, too. He cleared his throat.
Well, anyway, I think it's time we went to bed. I mean, we don't have a bed, and beds, so it's time we go to sleeping bags. Damn it, what I'm trying to say is that you should sleep first. I'll take the first watch and wake you up later, all right?
Neph watched him fumble his words with a strange expression, and then nodded silently.
What the hell was that, and what was I even saying?
Soon, the fire died, and Sunny was left alone. Neph was asleep, and he could hear the soft sound of her breathing not too far away after hesitating for a bit. Sunny summoned Nightmare and ordered him to guard her sleep. At that moment, the Sin of Solace suddenly said,
Wow, Sunny, you really have a way with words. A real charmer. I wouldn't say that torturing insects is a very romantic topic of conversation, but other than that.
Sunny ground his teeth, refusing to look at the pale apparition. Her knew exactly what the bastard looked like, anyway.
Then shut up.
With Nightmare guarding Sunny's dreams, his sleep was deep and peaceful. His awakening, however, wasn't. What? Sunny woke from feeling the world tilt, and then quake with a violent shudder. He was thrown sideways and collided with the slope of the fissure. Feeling the sharp rocks cutting into his skin, groggy and disoriented, he tried to stand up, but got tangled in the sleeping bag instead. Damn it! The sleeping bag disintegrated as he tore through it, already summoning the Sin of Solace and the Moonlight Shard. What's going on? He demanded. The world lurched once again, and the deafening roar of water reached his ear, assessing his surroundings through shadow sense. Sunny didn't notice immediate danger. He did, however, notice Nephis. She had climbed out of the fissure and was now standing on its edge, her white tunic and silver hair fluttering in the wind. Sunny couldn't see her face, but judging by the lack of weapons in her hands, the situation wasn't critical. He let out a relieved sigh, then glanced at the destroyed sleeping bag with regret. Just a moment later, the dark island shuddered again, and a strange tremor ran through the black turtle's stone shell. At that moment, an obnoxious voice resounded from his left. Good morning, rise and shine. Throwing a contemptuous glance at the spirit of the Sin of Solace, Sunny grimaced and pushed himself off the ground, soaring high into the air. He kicked the slope of the fissure and propelled himself even higher, landing noiselessly near Nephis a moment later. What's happening? He asked. The 7 suns were already rising, and the world was suffused with the golden radiance of dawn. Instead of answering, she pointed her finger at a particular spot off the edge of the island. There, the water was turbulent and foamy, rising in violent waves. The river had washed away most of the blood during the night, but now it was painted red once again. In fact, the red color was more vivid and intense than ever. What the? Sunny muttered. Sunny frowned. The next moment, something large and swift moved beneath the surface of the red water, and the carcass of the black turtle quaked again, as more blood poured into the great river. There was a strange sound. Soon, the Azure Serpent's giant head rose from the turbulent water and stared at them with its vicious, cloudy eyes. Streams of red were flowing from its impenetrable scales. This time, however, there was something different about the great beast. Clenched tightly in its harrowing jaws was a huge chunk of red, bleeding meat, still staring at them with malice. The creature moved its jaw and started chewing it. Needless to say, the sight was more than a little disturbing. Standing by Sunny's side, Nephis said, "It's eating the turtle." He glanced at her with a strange expression.
Yeah, I've noticed.
With that, both of them fell silent as they watched the serpent, who was watching them while devouring the meat of the slain great monster. Yesterday, Sunny had struggled with chewing through the tough meat of the black turtle, but it was almost melting in the abomination's enormous maw. The jade fangs were painted red as they effortlessly sliced through the bleeding chunk, which was diminishing at an alarming rate. He couldn't help but shudder when imagining what these fangs would do to his own flesh. No armor memory he possessed and no attribute augmenting his body stood a chance of resisting the fangs of the great beast even for a split second. If those jaws closed on Sunny, he would be obliterated in an instant. Sunny stared at the feasting serpent. Then, suddenly, a long sigh escaped from his lips.
You know what? I am really damn tired of this.
Nephis looked at him with a silent question as he asked, "Tired of what?"
It's just nothing ever goes as it's supposed to, does it? I remember surrendering myself to the cops when I became infected. They told me this and that about how the process of awakening is supposed to happen, and I swear to the dead gods, not a single thing they told me to expect ended up coming true.
A darkly exasperated expression appeared on his face.
My first nightmare, an awakened tyrant appears at the solstice. There's a fallen terror blocking the only way out, the second nightmare. Here's a couple of immortal saints I need to kill, and they're completely out of their minds, really. I went through so many absolutely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, and awakened.
Sunny rolled his eyes.
I am a master now, and instead of fighting fallen nightmare creatures like masters are supposed to do, there's this great beast staring me down. Let's not even mention all the corrupted abominations I've already killed. Is this what they call suffering from success? If so, I really don't want to be such an overachiever anymore. Can't something normal happen for once?
Listening to him, Nephis tilted her head a little. She remained silent for a bit, and then said,
You really had to overcome completely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, awakened, and master.
Then, a hint of a smile appeared on her lips, and sparks of white light ignited in her eyes.
But Sunny, considering all that, have you thought about what kind of things you'll have to face as a saint?
Sunny's already pale face suddenly became even whiter. A hint of horror appeared in his eyes, and he whispered, "Gods." He shivered.
You evil, no, I don't want to even think about it.
Smiling, Nephis looked away and concentrated on the Azure Serpent once again. After a few moments of silence, she said,
Maybe you should consider this as training, then, in any case, what do you think we should do now?
Sunny threw a gloomy glance her way and shrugged.
I am not sure. The turtle is huge, so even this old snake won't be able to hollow its shell out quickly. I don't think it can overturn the carcass or break through the carapace at this point, but I am not sure. We should be ready for anything, I guess.
Nephis lingered for a while and then nodded.
I agree. Let's wait and see, then.
As the enormous carcass of the great monster shuddered once again, they stood side by side and watched silently as the water was slowly saturated with crimson blood. At first, Sunny and Nephis were tense and fully focused, observing the feasting serpent with grim apprehension and a bit of dread, but then, slowly, it got a little boring. Even though very few people had ever gotten a chance to see a great beast devour a great monster, or maybe none at all, as it turned out. Even such a macabre and awesome spectacle could grow old really fast. The black turtle was just too enormous. Even though the Azure Serpent was gigantic itself, it still couldn't devour a significant portion of its carcass in a short amount of time. No matter how hard it tried, it would probably take the creature days, or even weeks, to put a dent in the floating corpse of the titanic monster. Eventually, Sunny and Nephis found themselves sitting side by side on the green moss, looking silently at the great river. The two of them made for a striking contrast. Sunny was wearing a tunic of black silk embroidered with silver thread, his hair black as a raven's wing. Nephis was wearing a tunic, too, hers perfectly white and decorated with red accents. Her long silver hair was moving slightly in the wind. One's eyes were like two pools of unfathomable darkness. The others were gray, calm, and hid within them a boundless, immolating heat. Both would have seemed too flawless and beautiful to a mundane human, with perfectly smooth alabaster skin and faces that seemed to have been chiseled from precious stone by a divine sculptor. Surrounded by the vast expanse of a mystical river and sitting calmly atop the shell of a great monster. Wearing no armor and holding no weapons in their hands, they looked like two transient deities that had descended from the heavenly realm to rest on the soft moss and enjoy the breathtaking beauty of this strange world. Of course, Sunny had none of these thoughts. Instead, he had an entirely different view of the current situation, and he muttered, "This is." Over the years, he had grown accustomed to being in the company of armor-clad awakened, heavily armed soldiers and military vehicles, looking at the slender silhouette of Nephis' body outlined by the light fabric of her tunic and the weightless silk of his own graceless dusk. He couldn't help but feel a sense of strange incongruity. They were currently in the most dire predicament of their habitually dire lives, and yet...
What the hell? We look like we're enjoying a luxury cruise.
Of course, leisure cruises and getaways on tropical islands hadn't been a thing since before the dark times. Sunny just found the idea amusing after randomly learning about that ancient tradition from Rain, and was reminded of that conversation right now. He knew that being surrounded by great abominations wasn't exactly one's idea of a relaxing vacation. However, the corpse of the black turtle was technically floating, so it was like a ship at the same time. It was large enough to be an island, the food was delicious, the view was to die for, the company was very nice, too. If not for the blooded snout of the Azure Serpent rising above the water from time to time, he would have actually been quite content. Sensing his strange mood, Nephis looked at him and raised an eyebrow.
You have that funny look in your eyes.
Sunny coughed.
I was just thinking that this entire situation is weirdly peaceful. We are on top of a dead great monster, and there's a great beast slowly devouring that monster as it waits for a chance to munch on our souls, and yet there's nothing to do.
He scratched his head.
Let me tell you, the start of my second nightmare was nowhere near as relaxing. Plus, this black turtle, it's kind of like a ship, isn't it? So we're relaxing on a ship. I just think it's funny.
Nephis blinked a couple of times, then stared at the black expanse of the black turtle's shell. After a short pause, she said awkwardly,
You would know better. I actually was never on a real ship.
Sunny tilted his head a little.
Oh, that's right. She was brought to Antarctica by Whispering Blade. She never sailed across the ocean on an alloy battleship. Only flew through the sky aboard the chain breaker.
He chuckled.
Well, it's not that special. Mostly, you just stay inside and pray that the ship doesn't start splitting around you, or that something from the outside doesn't come inside to pay you a visit. By the way, both of those things happen to me, so no matter how strange it feels to say, this feels much nicer.
Nephis hesitated for a few moments, then looked away. Her voice was even when she said,
This is much nicer than the start of my second nightmare, too, because I am not alone.
Sunny looked at her carefully. A strange thought surfaced in his mind.
Was she going to say something else?
He suddenly felt tense again, a lot of very complicated emotions that Sunny had done his best to avoid for a long time reared their heads in his heart. Was she? Luckily, or unfortunately, the Azure Serpent chose that exact moment to let out a frenzied roar and dive back into the water, sending a huge fountain of it flying into the sky. It seemed that the old snake had been satiated. By now, full of renewed vigor, the serpent started circling the black turtle once again, raising its head from time to stare at them with deranged eyes. Sunny sighed.
This snake just never gives up, does it?
Nephis silently nodded and then stood up, illuminated by the light of the 7 suns and outlined against the blue sky. Her lithe figure was like a painting.
but it really can't overturn the carcass or break the shell. We don't need to keep watching it for now.
Sunny raised an eyebrow and asked, "So then, what should we do?" She thought for a while, then glanced at the soft carpet of green moss and the mysterious landscape of the dark island. Eventually, Nephis shrugged and suggested, "Whatever we want." After resting for a while, Sunny and Nephis separated. She went off to study the memories Sir Gilead had transferred to her. There hadn't been a lot of time to get a proper feel for them in the nightmare desert. Sunny, meanwhile, remained sitting on the soft moss with a contemplative expression. What to do? First, he closed his eyes and sent the 5 shadows to investigate the dark island. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 kilometers across, so there wasn't a lot of ground to cover. However, the terrain of the giant shell of black rock was weathered and uneven. There were plenty of cracks and fissures, some of them large and easy to notice. Others hidden from view, some were entirely filled with water. The exploration didn't take too long. His shadows didn't find anything really interesting. Either there was the weathered rock, the vibrant patches of green moss, and the remains of the creature's battle armor, its silver now tarnished and bleak. Other than that, the dark island was desolate and barren. What made a deep impression on Sunny, though, were the fissures themselves. At first, he had assumed that they were just natural features of the great monster's stone shell. But after some time, with a shiver, he realized that they weren't. Instead, each of the deep grooves was a scar left on the titanic shell of the ancient creature by unknown enemies. None managed to penetrate it, and some were rather shallow. However, some were dark and frighteningly deep, considering that even the Azure Serpent wasn't able to crack the black turtle's carapace. Sunny dreaded to imagine what kind of creatures had left those claw marks on its back. He looked at the gleaming expanse of the great river with gloom. Suddenly, the enchanting beauty of this dreamlike world seemed like a facade that hid unspeakable horrors behind its alluring veil, and he observed, "Beautiful things are the most dangerous." Of course, Sunny had known that already, but in that moment he felt it stronger than ever before. Glancing in the direction where Nephis had left, he sighed and stretched his legs. The shadows returned, and then 3 figures rose from them, Onyx Saint, Nightmare, and Ravenous Fiend. He silently studied them for a while, thinking. Saint was stoic and indifferent, as always. If he didn't know that she was alive, he would have assumed that the graceful and towering figure in front of him was a beautiful statue. Nightmare was staring at the Azure Serpent, which was circling the island, with dark and malevolent fury burning in his crimson eyes. Imp seemed a little uncomfortable under Sunny's gaze, shifting from foot to foot nervously. Nightmare was the weakest of the 3, but also offered the most utility to Sunny. He didn't necessarily need to use the Tenebra stallion as a battle companion. That said, his steed was very close to unlocking the terror ability and finally realizing its full potential. The next rank was also not far away. Once Nightmare came into his power as a terror and ascended, his power would take a great leap. Sunny had little means of speeding up that process at the moment, though it was going to happen when it happened, probably before too long. Saint, meanwhile, was already incredibly powerful. She was so powerful, in fact, that Sunny had no means of pushing her to greater power anymore. To make the graceful Stone Knight achieve the supreme rank, he would need 300 transcendent memories of the first tier, or 600 ascended ones, or 1,200 awakened ones. Needless to say, these numbers were unattainable at the moment. He didn't even want to count the potential number of dormant memories she would need to rank up, reaching a higher class. Meanwhile, required luck and stumbling on a uniquely suitable enemy. It was outside his control. Saint had already classed up twice, but the rest of his shadows, excluding the aberrant Soul Serpent, had yet to do it even once. That went to show how rare such opportunities were. There was one thing Sunny could do right now, though. Glancing at Saint, he sent Morgan's warbow and the stifled scream her way. The bow was self-explanatory. He was planning to make Saint the sentry for as long as they remained on the dark island. The stifled scream, however, was more tricky. That charm of his had an enchantment called Echoing Silence. Its description read, "When wearing this charm, the physical power of its master is augmented, but only as long as they remain silent. The longer their silence lasts, uninterrupted, the greater the boon of power they'll receive." This was a powerful enchantment indeed, and one perfectly suited for the taciturn shadow. However, he had never managed to get a lot out of it, because there had never been an opportunity to keep Saint summoned for weeks on end. Right now, however, there was an interesting idea in Sunny's head.
The physical augmentation, the stifled scream, grows stronger the longer one stays silent, so it functions in relation to time.
Weren't they flowing through time, though? Sunny didn't know how exactly the distance traveled on the Great River corresponded to time, but he assumed that it wasn't a small amount. Were they moving one day into the past each day? 1 month? 1 year? If so, then the augmentation of the stifled scream could potentially reach its theoretical limit in no time. That was an outlandish theory, but it was worth checking out, at least. Satisfied, Sunny turned to Imp. On paper, the scrawny goblin was on the same level of power as Saint. He was a transcendent devil as well, but in reality, there was an insurmountable gap between them. Imp was just an adolescent as far as shadows went, after all. He was still on the weaker side, inexperienced and untrained. His core physical attribute, the lesser steel body, had just recently evolved to the greater steel body. Sunny had thought that it would be extremely hard to locate large quantities of metal of higher quality than the body of Sun Prince. But, as it turned out, he was wrong. They were currently on top of the Black Turtle's titanic corpse, and that corpse was encased in the remains of similarly titanic battle armor. Surely, the armor deserving of a great monster would be made of some truly incredible stuff. Looking at the nervous Imp, Sunny grinned and pointed to the nearest jagged chunk of tarnished silver.
Go, buddy, and gorge yourself and bon appetit.
The scrawny goblin tentatively turned to look in the direction he was pointing. A few moments later, its eyes dramatically widened.
I bet it's going to be a bit tough to chew, Bo.
Before Sunny could finish speaking, Imp was already dashing toward the band of ancient silver with a maddened expression. He chuckled. I guess it smells delicious. With Saint standing guard, Nightmare keeping her company, and Imp happily munching on the tarnished silver of the great monster's battle armor, Sunny was once again left with nothing much to do. The 7 suns were shining in the 3-colored sky. The clear waters of the great river were flowing as they sparkled in the sunlight. The Azure Serpent was hungrily circling the dark island, ramming it from time to time to make its wrathful madness known. The sin of Solace was brooding silently. A gentle breeze was playing with Sunny's hair. With a sigh, he swept it back and rose, planning to go find Nephis. This is too weird. He had expected many situations to arise at the start of the 3rd nightmare, but one thing he hadn't expected was being left with nothing urgent to do, walking across the weathered surface of the black rock. Sunny went around a torn band of dull silver, traversed a few patches of moss, and finally laid his eye on Nephis. She was training, holding an unfamiliar longsword. Nephis was practicing a complicated chain of moves, her silver hair dancing in the air. There were beads of sweat on her face, and the hem of the airy tunic was flaring, revealing smooth porcelain skin. Her movements were limber and flowing, gracefully cascading into each other. The sight of it was beautiful. Neph's swordsmanship was beautiful, and she was beautiful too, illuminated by the dreamlike radiance of the 7 suns and dancing with a silvery sword on a carpet of green moss. With her white tunic and alabaster skin, she was like a fairy. Sunny found himself standing motionlessly in the shadow of a rock outcropping. Watching, he had been planning to call out to Nephis, but now, forgetting about it, he silently remained where he was. Some time passed. Sunny wasn't sure how much exactly. The island trembled once more. Eventually, he shifted slightly, as though escaping a reverie, and took a step forward to escape the shadows. Hey! Nephis stopped and leaned on her sword, breathing heavily. Her chest was rising and falling, and her face was slightly flushed. Walking over, Sunny summoned the endless spring and offered it to her with a friendly smile, accepting the beautiful glass bottle. She sat down and wiped the sweat off her face, then threw her head back and drank greedily. Thank you. Sunny glanced at her slender neck and the beads of sweat glistening above the collar of her tunic, which was slightly damp and sticking a little to her body. Then he looked away after drinking her fill. Nephis returned the endless spring to Sunny. He hesitated for a moment, then drank some of the cool, refreshing water himself and sat down near her. He had completely forgotten what he was going to say after a moment or two of peaceful silence. Sunny finally remembered.
I've been thinking, currently, the most powerful combatant among us is the Onyx Saint, my shadow. You must know that she's a transcendent devil now. Should something happen, she would be our best bet against the old snake. We should try augmenting her with both of our aspects, and test just how strong she would become.
They already knew that Nephis was able to share her flames with his shadows, but the last time they had attempted it was a lifetime ago, in the basement of his home in Northern Quadrant Siege Capital. Saint had been a mere ascended demon back then, while Sunny had been an early-stage devil. Now, she was a transcendent devil, and he was a tyrant, and Nephis was a terror. She had absorbed a great number of soul shards during the Battle of the Black Skull, and gained the last few in the Nightmare Desert. The situation back then had been too desperate and frenetic to think about it, and honestly, Sunny didn't really care about competing with her anymore. All their powers had risen, perhaps, with the help of shadows and soul flame. Saint would be able to scratch against the level of strength of a supreme creature. Of course, there was a big problem. As a being whose flesh was akin to stone, she couldn't swim, and would immediately sink if pushed into the great river. Still, it was worth testing. Nephis nodded.
Yes, that sounds like a good idea.
She leaned back a little and closed her eyes, enjoying the cool caress of the breeze with a faint smile. Sunny watched her silently for a few moments. Eventually, he said, "Your swordsmanship has changed." Neff's favored style was always flowing and unpredictable, but now it had assumed a strange, almost mystical quality. Sunny had been a complete novice when they first met. His skill now was incomparable with that of 4 years ago. He had grown with an explosive, truly astonishing speed, but Nephis had grown too. Perhaps her progress wasn't quite as stunningly rapid. She didn't have the benefit of having an aspect legacy to fuel it. After all, but compared to even the most talented humans, it was still tremendously swift. Sunny and Nephis had sparred a lot after she returned from the second nightmare, but she had been held back by her nascent essence control back then. Now, she had fully come into her power as a master and was able to push her skill to entirely new limits, maybe even past them. Opening her eyes, Nephis smiled and conceded, "I guess it did." Then, she leaned forward and looked into the distance with a contemplative expression.
For me, my understanding of swordsmanship went through a transformation after the ascension.
Sunny raised an eyebrow, sound serious. She nodded with a distant look.
It was because of learning to control my essence. Awakened possess a rudimentary form of essence control. They broadly enhance their entire bodies with essence, sometimes narrowing the scope down to a particular limb. After learning to do it as easily as breathing, they can become masters and naturally transition to a much more targeted, intricate, and efficient manner of using essence.
Her eyes glinted.
But I've never been an awakened. I went straight to being a master, so learning to control essence was very hard for me. I had to be conscious of every muscle in my body, every tendon and every bone. It was like learning to walk again.
A corner of Sunny's mouth twitched as he suppressed a smile. He vividly remembered helping her pass these exact obstacles. Nephis, meanwhile, continued.
So I had to go back to basics. Which groups of muscles do I need to enhance to perform the cut in the most efficient and effective way? My hand, my shoulder, my back, my core, my thighs, my calves, everything had to work in harmony to produce the best result. It took a while to become proficient enough in controlling essence to do it right without thinking, and in the process I became much more aware of my body. I also got submerged in studying the basics. It's on a much deeper level than before, going deeper and deeper.
Sunny looked at her with curiosity and asked, "How deep are we talking about?" She smiled, lingered for a moment, and then said, "Force equals mass times acceleration." He blinked and what? Sunny hadn't expected to hear a physics formula, and he only knew that this was a physics formula because teacher Julius had once thrown a tantrum about his lack of education and forced him to read a bunch of children's school books. What? He repeated. Nephis smiled.
That's the basis of swordsmanship or spearmanship or any other kind of weapon skill. Fundamentally, it's all about delivering force. The amount of force is dependent on mass and acceleration. Your body is the source of that force, and your weapon is a force multiplier. It concentrates it into a narrow tip, thus making it easier to deliver lethal damage.
She pointed to the sharp tip of her sword.
Of course, there are more nuances to that. For example, speed doesn't exist in a vacuum, it's relative to the enemy. Your body also has to borrow from the ground you're standing on. There's balance, centers of gravity, reaction speed. As for the sword itself, there's flexibility, material composition, center of percussion, and so on. There's also soul essence, memory enchantments, attributes, and aspect abilities to consider.
Sunny was looking at her incredulously, which caused Nephis to shrug in embarrassment.
Well, anyway, I've been studying the fundamentals, physics, anatomy, spell studies, and a bit of other stuff, a lot since returning from the second nightmare, and slowly incorporating these insights into my swordsmanship. Something like that.
He tilted his head, a bit dumbfounded.
That can't be right. How have we gone from the essence of combat is murder to force equals acceleration?
So Nephis had been studying science to shore up her fundamentals and evolve her swordsmanship. That sounded very strange, but the result was apparent. She had clearly improved by leaps and bounds since her ascension. Sunny shook his head in disbelief, and then threw a pointed look at her. His voice was incredulous as he asked, "Care for a spar?" With a faint smile on her face, Nephis nodded and raised her sword, pointing it at him in invitation. Sunny summoned the Sin of Solace and took a stance opposite her. From the forgotten shore to the basement of his home in the peaceful terrace district, they had trained with each other numerous times. This simple sequence of actions was as natural for them as breathing. However, today, there was an awkward pause. Sunny scratched the back of his head and glanced at the jade giant.
That isn't going to work, is it?
Nephis seemed to have come to a similar conclusion, looking at him sheepishly.
No, what the hell, since when does she know how to emote? This is just too cute.
He coughed. The problem facing them was that both had grown too powerful, and, subsequently, the weapons they used were too powerful, too. The Sin of Solace was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, and quite a harrowing one at that. Sunny wasn't entirely sure what the level of Neph's longsword was, but it had to be quite a menacing weapon, as well, considering that it had come from the sole arsenal of a saint. It would be already bad enough if the Sin of Solace damaged or destroyed it, but what if Sunny wasn't careful enough and scratched Nephis in the process? The curse of madness carried by the jade blade would either crush her mental defenses, or at least put debilitating pressure on her mind for a period of time, standing some distance away. The spirit of the giant smiled.
No, don't worry, I'll be gentle.
However, that smile of his was more than a little bit sinister. Sunny frowned, then dismissed the jade sword and got lost in thought for a few moments. Eventually, a smile of delight appeared on his lips, and he said, "Let's do this." The shadows around them suddenly moved and flowed toward him, then slowly formed into 2 inky black swords. One of them was a fearsome odachi, while the other was an elegant longsword. The odachi was easy to create. This was one of the shapes Sunny had practiced relentlessly. After all, the longsword was a little bit tricky, since he had never created one before. Nevertheless, he was familiar with it as well, and so managed to produce a passable one with some effort. One would think that manifesting shadows into a weapon would be easier than shaping them into articulated hands, since weapons were static by nature. However, in reality, shaping a sword was just as complex of a task. A good sword had to possess certain characteristics to feel right in the hand: weight, balance, flexibility, and rigidity, center of percussion that Neph had recently mentioned, and so on. It was especially daunting with something like the odachi, which possessed a flexible edge and a rigid spine. To improve in that regard, Sunny had even studied a bit of blacksmithing on the network. Back then, clan valor had been preventing him from visiting the dream realm, so he had a lot of free time. There were many levels to shadow manifestation, and shaping was only the most basic of them. Sunny could also affect the material composition of the manifested shadows, although that demanded a higher essence expenditure. He could manipulate the density of the shadows. For example, he could make them feel like steel or porous limestone. With some effort, he could even make them slippery or adhesive. In the past, all these internal transformations had been very difficult to achieve, but after inventing shadow incarnation, Sunny made a breakthrough in his mastery of shadow manifestation as well. Now, it was much easier, all that was to say. When Nephis dismissed her longsword and curiously took the shadow weapon from his hand, he secretly held his breath. She weighed the black longsword, then swung it a few times to test how it felt. Then, she nodded in satisfaction and said, "That works." Sunny suppressed a proud smile and raised his odachi. "Let's begin, then." That feeling, he missed it. The sin of solace was a piece of art in the form of a giant, but Sunny's heart still lay with blades like this one. Maybe because it was what he had learned swordsmanship with, wielding Midnight Shard on the Forgotten Shore, not to mention all the fun times he had had as Mongrel in the dreamscape. Raising the odachi slightly, Sunny pushed himself forward and attacked. The two of them were instantly entangled in a breathtaking dance of singing steel. Their swift figures blurred, and soon, nothing but a dark shape and a light shape could be seen, moving across the green moss as they weaved and circled around each other. It was as though two spirits were dancing under the bright light of the radiant suns. She really has improved. Sunny realized. Neph's swordsmanship felt different. It had always been somewhat ineffable due to her eerie ability to control both the battlefield and the enemy. But now, there was an even more bizarre quality to her graceful skill. The steps seemed the same, the cadence seemed the same, the offensive and defensive moves seemed the same. As well, however, these familiar elements were somehow entirely different and incredibly more dangerous. Her light steps never failed to deliver her into the best possible position to attack. Each strike packed a devastating punch that seemed too extreme even for an ascended terror. Her defense was nearly impenetrable, alternating between immovable hardness and inviting softness, which dissipated the force of Sunny's attacks and made him feel as though he was drowning in a bog. How is she so different? He wondered. No, he was drowning in her flowing sword. It wasn't as though Sunny didn't understand the same principles Neph had spoken about. The relationship between mass, acceleration, and force. He was intimately familiar with it, as well. After all, Sunny had long incorporated the ability to change his weight at will into his battle skill, so much so that it had become second nature to him. By manipulating how much his body, or various parts of it, weighed on the fly, he was able to enhance the force of his attacks, secure his balance, and even perform seemingly impossible moves by shifting his center of gravity. By now, it was like an instinct. He knew a lot about anatomy, too, both from his own training after the Ascension, mastery of shadow dance, and learning how to create shadow hands, everything that Nephis had mentioned. Sunny studied too, however, as they thought. He understood the difference between them. It was the difference between an intuitive, instinctual knowledge and a comprehensive, systemic understanding. And so, even though Sunny could perceive the essence of what Nephis was doing through shadow dance, he couldn't repeat it with the same level of insight. This was different from fighting Morgan. Morgan was supremely skilled, yes, but the main challenge of dueling her was the dire power of her enchanted body and her sharp, killing will. Nephis wasn't using any augmentations, and her will was vast and calm as an ocean. Beneath that indomitable calmness hid the fiery fury of a roaring flame. It was pure technique, pure insight, pure mastery, pure passion. Sunny frowned, feeling that he, too, was starting to sweat. Nephis was strong, but he was strong, too. Among human swordsmen, he was perhaps one of the strongest. His mind was clear. His elusive skill was perilously insidious. He wasn't the same person he had been before. Antarctica had forged him into someone much more steady, powerful, and deadly. Their duel was exhilarating. Sunny and Nephis climbed back into the familiar fissure only after the Seven Suns plunged into the waters of the Great River. They hungrily consumed the last few ration packs from the covetous coffer, and then settled on the weathered rock to sleep. Saint was standing guard above the fissure, and Nightmare was near to protect their dreams. So, they decided not to alternate and let themselves rest through the whole night. The world was swiftly enveloped in darkness. The nocturnal glow of the great river didn't reach the depths of the fissure, and there were no stars or the moon in the sky. The world was entirely black, as if they had plunged into an endless void, listening to the soft sounds of Neph's breath. Sonny let the sense of fatigue overwhelm him. He was tired, however. It wasn't the cruel, chilling exhaustion he had suffered often in the past months. Instead, this fatigue was of a satisfying and pleasurable kind. Something he hadn't felt in a while. Sonny had learned a lot during their training today. They had practiced together until the sunset, and in the process, both had done their best to make the opponent sweat. He hadn't held back much, and neither had Nephis in the end. Sonny found himself lacking. Even after all this time, she was still like a distant star, one he could see, but never touch, at least in terms of swordsmanship and mastery of battle. It should have been disheartening. But he found it strangely encouraging instead. Sonny felt as though he had been shown a new horizon, something to strive for, as well as a clear direction to reach for the stars. He also realized that there were still flaws in his mastery of shadow dance. That was a valuable revelation in and of itself. Armed with it, he could refine and perfect his formless style, bringing it closer to the next step. That said, Sonny felt very strange right now. It was because he had realized that, currently, he was more powerful than Nephis. Yes, she was a better fighter than him. However, Sonny had so many tools at his disposal. He also had 2 transcendent devils and an awakened terror on his side. If the 2 of them were to battle seriously, he wasn't entirely sure who would be left standing at the end. But he knew that his odds were much higher than hers. It was a vast, tumultuous, and deeply unsettling emotion. What surprised him the most, however, was how weak of a reaction it aroused in him. There had been a time when becoming more powerful than Nephis was all he ever thought about. But now, he felt almost indifferent. It was what it was. There was no point in racing to the finish line. Anyway, that line wouldn't change. It didn't matter which one of them became a terror first, because sooner or later, both of them would end up as titans. It didn't matter that Sonny was ahead for the first time. Her ascended ability wasn't of a kind that added to one's power. That was all. They were in the same boat. Anyway, perhaps he could allow himself to feel that way because he was more secure about the shadow bond and the power she held over him. Nephis had proven that she had no intention of ever using it, and he had grown more confident in his ability to make one or both of them die even if she did. He sighed, feeling calm and cozy in the darkness that enveloped them. After a while, Sonny asked with a sigh, "How romantic." "Hey, Neph, are you asleep yet?" There were few moments of silence before she answered, "No." Hidden in the darkness, he grinned.
How is the sleeping bag? Is it warm?
There had been only 2 sleeping bags in the covetous coffer, one that Sonny used in the wilderness, and a spare one. Sadly, he had ripped through one of them when the Azure Serpent first made the dark island quake. So now, there was only one. Sonny had chosen to sleep on the weathered rock, relying on the unique qualities of the marble shell to keep him comfortable. Luckily, the great river seemed to have a mild climate, so he wasn't particularly cold. The fissure protected them from the wind as well, so he had no problem letting Nephis use the only remaining sleeping bag. However, that didn't mean that he wouldn't tease her about it. A calm answer came from the darkness.
Yes, I am warm. It's of high quality.
As the grin froze on Sonny's face, he sighed. "She's really too thick to be teased, damn." A few moments later, Neph asked,
Do you want me to hand it over? It's your sleeping bag. It would only be right for the owner to use it.
Sonny flinched. Gods, she's hopeless.
No, keep it. That's not what I wanted at all.
There was a long pause, then Neph's voice came from the darkness again.
I see, you want to use it together.
Hearing that, Sonny's entire body shuddered.
No, that's not what I meant at all. Who do you take me for? I was just tasing you.
Suddenly, he heard a soft chuckle. Turning his head, Sonny saw Neph covering her mouth with a hand. She was suppressing a laugh. His eyes widened.
A reverse tease? I've been played.
His heart ached. How embarrassing. He stared at Nephis incredulously for a few moments, then laid down and looked back at the jagged line of the distant black sky. A moment or two later, he suddenly laughed, too.
This is just too ridiculous.
Nephis lowered her hand, then asked in an amused tone, "What's?" Sunny shrugged.
I mean, we are sailing a river of an unholy titan's blood on the corpse of a great monster, moving back in time and giggling like children.
She remained silent for a while before saying in her usual calm tone,
Yes, it does sound a little ridiculous.
Then there was a comfortable silence between them. Sunny looked at the black sky for a while. Soon, a sigh escaped from his lips. He lingered for a long time, then turned his head to look at her again and asked, "Neph, can I ask you something?" She turned her head to face him, as well, even though she couldn't see anything in the dark, and answered, "Sure." Sunny hesitated, but eventually he still asked,
Can you tell me what happened to you in the second nightmare?
A hint of amusement slowly disappeared from her eyes. Her faint smile was erased. As well, Nephis remained silent for a long time, her expression turning bleak and distant. Then, she sighed, "Okay, I'll tell you." Her voice sounded strangely forlorn. Turning away, Nephis looked into the darkness and said,
In my second nightmare, I was a woman made of stone, like your shadow, but also different, defective. It happened after the demon of destiny had his falling out with the goddess of the black skies, I think, but before hope escaped her chains, and the demons rose in rebellion against the gods, in the darkness, in the true darkness that fills the halls and caverns of the underworld, below the hollow mountains.
She sighed.
When I opened my eyes, I was a woman made of stone, a crude, clumsy, and defective precursor of the stone saints. I was laying on a mountain of abandoned statues just like me, all of them broken, discarded, and forsaken. Everything around me was enveloped by cold darkness, with not a spark of light or hint of warmth anywhere. There was just me, my broken siblings, and the lonesome silence.
Sunny shifted slightly, true darkness.
Those mountains are called hollow, but in fact, they're full of darkness. Their hollows are like great reservoirs of it. It's where darkness lives and where it comes from. True darkness is very much like this river. In fact, legends say that a terrible creature was slain by the gods once at the dawn of time and that its blood seeped into the earth. This is what true darkness is, the dark creature's blood.
Sunny shivered, that dark creature, to be the source of all true darkness, of the entire element of darkness. It had to be something far greater than an unholy titan. It must have been one of the unknown, then, a being of the void. Ignorant of what he was thinking about, Nephis continued after a short pause.
The hollow mountains are a scar left by the death of that creature, and so most of true darkness remains below them. This is the place that Nether made his home. However, it wasn't entirely empty. While he ruled the underworld, there were many others living in the darkness.
She lingered for a moment.
There were some who followed Nether, the remains of the army he had led to wage war on Storm God. They lived in the great hollows within the peaks. There were also his children, the Stone Saints, who lived below the mountains in the heart of the underworld. And there were also creatures who lived even lower, near the very bottom of the dark abyss. That's where the pile of discarded statues was.
Sunny frowned.
Wait, Nether waged war on Storm God on his own before the rebellion.
A pale smile appeared on Neph's face.
Yes, it was his own private affair. I don't know the details of his relationship with Storm God or why it ended in resentment. But he must have taken it to heart, enough so that he assembled an army and stormed the divine realm. Of course, he lost. Most of his army was decimated, and he secluded himself in the underworld, becoming its ruler and losing himself in the obsession of trying to create the Stone Saints.
She paused for a moment.
He must have been lonely and heartbroken to create a whole race of living beings just to keep him company. Or maybe it was his defiant, prideful way of challenging the gods. After all, only the gods could create living things. Despite that, somehow Nether succeeded. but he failed many times before achieving success.
Nephis grew silent for a moment and then said,
I was one of these failures.
A quiet sigh escaped from her lips.
There were many creatures in the darkness at the roots of the underworld, all of them abandoned and discarded, just like me. Some of them were the results of Nether's failed attempts to create the stone saints. Some of them were outcasts and derelicts for whom there was no place in the world above anymore. All of them were pitiful and weak, and I was the weakest of them all.
Nephis stared silently into the darkness for a while. The expression on her face was sad and remorseful. Eventually, she spoke softly.
I was just a sleeper. After all, even with the echo I gained in the nightmare desert, out there in the darkness, my strength was pitiful. It was such a blow. I never realized how much pride I took in being strong before that nightmare. I had always relied on my strength. I had always told myself that I had to be strong. If only I was strong like my father, if only I was strong, stronger, the strongest, then I wouldn't break apart. And the people around me wouldn't need to suffer on my behalf, either.
Sunny remained silent, remembering Neph's nightmare that he had visited after she returned to the waking world. He also thought about his own desperate pursuit of strength. Nephis smiled.
But in the nightmare, all my strength was worthless, all my pride was worthless, too. All I had was weakness, and so I had to learn that personal power wasn't something I should rely on or could rely on. It had always seemed so important, but in the end, it turned out to be a deceitful mirage.
A slight frown appeared on her face.
You see, there weren't only the outcasts and discarded creatures like me in the darkness at the roots of the underworld. There were other things as well, terrifying things that were born from the darkness. These things hunted us. There were ancient horrors dwelling in the very depths of the abyss. As well, sometimes they would crawl from below to devour us. No one in the underworld cared about what happened to us if they even remembered our existence. The aloof demon of destiny, the first generation of the stone saints, and the remains of the demon's soldiers, none would protect us. The Forsaken had to fend for themselves, but we were weak and pitiful, and, most of all, we were divided.
Her voice shook a little. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then asked carefully,
So, what did you do? How did you survive?
Nephis took a deep breath.
I had to accept my weakness and learn how to survive despite being weak. The lesson was harsh, demeaning, and painful, but I had no choice but to learn it, so I coaxed, persuaded, deceived, enticed, and cajoled the other forsaken creatures living in the darkness. But most of all, I inspired them. You see, I realized that there was something much sharper than my wit, much more persuasive than my words, and much more compelling than my lies.
She paused for a moment. That something was desire. Hidden in the darkness, Sunny flinched. The image of the piece of wet wood littered with demented runes suddenly appeared in his mind, as did the word repeating in the runes over and over again. Wish, desire, be careful of what you wish for, be careful what you desire. He frowned while Nephis continued somberly.
All I had to do was instill a desire in the Forsaken, a desire for a better life, longer life, safer life, a yearning for things that they had either never known or long forgot. Comfort, companionship, warmth. I had to give them hope, because we couldn't survive alone, but we could survive together. Most of these creatures were solitary and numb, resigned to their dark existence. The weight of their hopelessness and despair was too great for me to pull them from it. But by igniting a yearning in their hearts, I could make them push themselves forward with their own strength.
She grew silent once again, and remained so for a long time this time. When Nephis spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper.
We gathered together and built a village. It had tall walls and stone houses. It even had a large hall for us to gather and enjoy each other's company. And for a while, life was good, united. We could protect ourselves from the creatures of darkness and hide from the abyssal visitors behind the tall walls. I thought that I was on the right track. There were old creatures in the village that taught me their knowledge and wisdom. There were those who had been warriors once. I learned from them. As well, I was the weakest one, but I was liked and valued because I could create light, which all of them had forgotten.
White sparks ignited in her eyes before trembling and disappearing. Neph's face grew motionless.
But then someone in the village vanished, and then someone else. At first, I thought that they had left, but after the third one was gone, the fourth, the fifth, we all realized that something was wrong. They didn't leave, they were taken. After that, every night, what served as night in the underworld, someone would disappear. We were under attack.
She paused.
We tried everything in our power to find and confront the creature that was killing the villagers. We enhanced our defenses, increased our vigilance. We investigated. We explored the surrounding darkness for clues. We set traps, carved sorceress runes into the stone, and placed lures. We even sent an envoy to plead for help from the children of Nether, but nothing worked.
Neph's voice was growing dull.
Nothing we did manage to stop the disappearances. In fact, it only grew worse. At first, the Forsaken were just vanishing, but later, their mutilated corpses started to appear around the village, strewn on stalagmites for us to see, as though the creature was leaving them there to mock us. It was then that I understood that I hadn't created a safe haven for us, and instead, simply set the table for the creature of darkness.
Her face was motionless, and her voice was even, however. Sunny could feel how fragile that mask was at the moment. Neph took a deep breath.
Eventually, everything collapsed. Those who were still alive cursed me and abandoned the village. They didn't make it far. There were only 2 of us left inside the empty walls, myself and another one of the broken statues. The first one who had become my companion and followed me almost from the very start. We locked ourselves inside the village hall, not knowing what else to do, and barricaded the doors. However, the creature still came. I didn't see it enter, but I could feel that the darkness around us was suddenly alive.
Sunny looked at her carefully and asked, "So, how did you defeat it?" Nephis slowly shook her head.
I had thought about giving one last, desperate fight, but as soon as I sensed it, I knew that there was no hope. That thing, it wasn't something I could fight, so I spoke to it. I tried to appease it. I tried to persuade it. I even knelt and begged it. I tried everything I could, and I could feel it watching me, listening to me, surrounding me.
For a while, there was silence. In that silence, Nephis shivered and let out a heavy sigh.
In the end, the creature took my companion, but spared me. I don't know why. All I know is that the darkness felt empty again, and I was suddenly alone in that darkness. I was the only one left in the village that we had built. Everyone else, all of them, were dead.
Her voice trembled a little.
That was the end of my nightmare.
Sunny sighed and sat up. Summoning the endless spring, Nephis had talked for a while after all. Her throat must have been parched, approaching her in the darkness. Sunny sat down and used his nail to clink against the glass bottle a couple of times. To let her know where it was, Nephis took the bottle and took a small sip, then looked at the ground. Sunny hesitated for a moment.
The appraisal, do you remember how the spell appraised your performance?
Nephis shook her head.
Pretty out of it, there at the end. I remember standing in the middle of the empty hall, and the next thing I remember was you calling me by my true name at the academy.
Sunny sighed, then leaned forward and lightly patted her on the shoulder.
Well, if it means anything, I think you did well. You did really well, Neph.
He felt her body tremble slightly, and then took the endless spring from her fingers.
Thank you for telling me. Now let's sleep.
He lingered for a moment and then added lightly.
Please be careful with the sleeping bag, though, and don't rip it. It's really expensive.
She nodded, then smiled faintly and lay down. Turning away, Sunny looked at Neph's back for a few moments, then silently returned to his own sleeping spot and sprawled on the weathered rock. He stared at the black sky for a few moments before closing his eyes.
Would I've survived that nightmare?
Sunny really didn't know. He could also tell that Nephis had brushed past many perilous fights and dire torments that she must have endured there. in the darkness. All alone, his heart was heavy, but before too long, the exhaustion won, sending him into the embrace of sleep. In the morning, the island shook again. Sonny opened his eyes and reached through the shadow sense, checking in on Saint, since the taciturn knight was standing calmly above the fissure. He relaxed and yawned with great satisfaction. He felt incredibly refreshed. The dark island was in one piece, and nothing was pouncing to kill them. Life was great. He sat up, leaned on the slope of the fissure, then rubbed his eyes and looked around. Nephis was already up, doing light stretches a few meters away. Sonny watched her for a few moments, then forced himself to avert his gaze. The sound of her even, yet fragile voice resounding from the darkness still echoed in his ears. Neph's second nightmare was different from his own, just like her first nightmare had been. She hadn't battled immortal saints to free an imprisoned demon from divine chains. Instead, she had tried to save a small group of pitiful and forlorn creatures, only to watch them all die. Nephis had been the last one standing on the forgotten shore, and after traveling alone through the purgatory of the nightmare desert, she built a tiny community amidst the cold darkness, only to watch it be destroyed. She had been so strong, but the nightmare made her weak. She had been so proud, but the nightmare made her beg for mercy on her knees. He wasn't sure he could imagine how painful it was for her to sacrifice the two things that were at the core of her sense of self. Yes, Neph hadn't slain impossibly powerful enemies with her radiant sword in the nightmare, but for her, wielding a sword against an overwhelming foe wasn't something to be feared. Maybe that was why the spell always tried to break her in some other, more cruel way. Sonny looked down at the weathered surface of the black rock and mused. The spell, I wonder. How had the spell appraised Neph's performance in the second nightmare? Sonny wasn't sure, but he had an inkling that the appraisal was exceedingly high. If his theory was right, that was, and the appraisal depended on how much the challenger had changed the flow of fate in that regard. He suspected that what Nephis had done was miraculous. She had wanted to change the fates of the forsaken creatures living in the darkness at the bottom of the underworld. In that task, she failed. However, she had succeeded in changing something else. She changed the harrowing creature that had come from the darkness. Had the creature been compelled by her words, by her pleas? Or had it been infected by the same yearning that Neph had ignited in the hearts of the forsaken? Had the creature of darkness been poisoned by a hint of an indescribable longing? Had it learned to long for light? If the heart of an abyssal being powerful enough to be a horror in the underworld had been changed, even ever so slightly, then Sonny couldn't really imagine what ripples that change could cause in the great tapestry of fate. So, the spell could have appraised Neph's performance as glorious. But that wasn't important, because Nephis herself didn't see it that way. The spell and its carriers had different criteria for success. After all, the spell might be satisfied with Neph's performance. But Neph obviously saw it as a bitter, irredeemable failure. The tone of her voice yesterday had said it all, continuing to stare at the ground. Sonny sighed after returning to the waking world. Nephis seemed much more mellow than before, but her resolve to kill the sovereigns and destroy the spell also seemed much more stalwart than before. Now that he knew the truth, many things about her past words and actions made sense.
Gods, just what am I going to do with her?
Sonny glanced at Nephis, who was oblivious to his thoughts, with a complicated expression. There was one more thing he had to consider: the description of Neph's aspect, light bringer. You're a creature of light that was banished and doomed to exist in the darkness. You bring radiance and warmth to wherever you go, but with it comes indescribable longing. Wasn't it very similar to the trial the spell had presented her with in the second nightmare? The ascended ability she had unlocked as a result was called longing. 2. Longing, yearning, desire, wish was the inexhaustible longing to destroy the spell that burned like fire in Neph's heart, so powerful that it made her soul incorruptible. He had pondered about this ability of hers before, but now Sonny saw it in a new light. It had seemed like a rather useless power to have, outside of very rare circumstances, like facing the Skinwalker. However, if that ability made Nephis immune to the corruption, Then wasn't it actually the most broken and unbelievably preposterous ability he had ever heard about? After all, even Weaver had to sever their arm when it got infected with the corruption. Not only was the great and terrible demon of fate not immune to corruption, he or she was even powerless in front of it. Just what was Nephis exactly? And more importantly, what was she to him? The subject of his thoughts, meanwhile, finished her stretching exercises, pulled the fastened strap of her white tunic back to her pale shoulder, and looked around. Nephis smiled and asked, "You're up?" Nephis smiled, Sunny smiled back, "Yeah, how are you feeling?" It seemed as though she had recovered from opening the old wounds to tell him about her second nightmare yesterday. However, a moment later, Neph's smiling face darkened a little. She sighed.
I wanted to make breakfast, but we have no food left.
Sunny tilted his head, then looked down. They were literally sitting on a mountain of meat, but with the Azure Serpent circling the carcass of the black turtle. Diving into the river to procure even a little bit of it was an utterly lethal task. He shook his head with resignation.
We'll solve that problem when the time comes.
Nephis nodded, lingered for a moment, then pointed to the sleeping bag. "See, I didn't rip it." Sunny stared at her, trying to determine whether she was being serious or playing a joke on him. These days, it was getting hard to tell.
Which bastard is being such a bad influence on my straight-laced and awkward Neph? I am going to bash their teeth in.
He remained silent for a few moments, then grinned.
Good, because you still owe me for that projector.
Time flowed lazily, both literally and figuratively. The current of the great river was pulling the corpse of the black turtle into the past, and several days passed in a strange but pleasant idleness. The 7 suns rose and fell, drowning in the shimmering waters. The sky was like a dreamlike painting of lilac, azure, crimson, and jet black. The ancient serpent continued to circle the dark island, slowly consuming the bleeding meat of the great monster it had killed, and watching Sunny and Nephis enjoy their unexpected respite. The two of them were spending their time leisurely, feeling the need to rest and recuperate after the nightmarish gauntlet of the white desert. They weren't in a hurry to strain themselves too much. They slept peacefully through the nights, rising when warm sunlight flowed into the narrow fissure, and spent most of the days together. Sometimes they would lay on the soft moss side by side and look at the sky in comfortable silence. Sometimes they would train, sparring with each other until sweat covered their bodies. Sometimes they would talk, discussing their experiences in the past year and various pieces of knowledge they had picked up along the way. They also spent some time apart. Nephis was busy practicing her swordsmanship, often requesting Saint to aid her as a training partner, after sending her and his shadow off. Sunny would get busy with his own endeavors. He spent a lot of time studying the strange and hauntingly complex weave of the key of the estuary. This memory was a great mystery that had to be solved, even after showing it to Nephis. Sunny hadn't a single inkling of what it was supposed to do and where it had come from, so he settled for the slow approach of meticulously examining each and every thread of its somber tapestry, depending on luck. This task could take him many months to complete, but there was no harm in starting early, once his head started to ache from studying the black weave. Sunny would sit silently near the slopes of the island and watch the Azure Serpent prowl. He would close his eyes and sense the great beast's shadow. He would try to memorize its every scale, scar, and movement. Even though their situation was peaceful right now, he knew that the peace wouldn't last indefinitely. The chances were that they would have to battle the abomination eventually, and so Sunny wanted to glean its essence and commit it to his memory, training his swordsmanship with Nephis, studying the estuary key, observing the Azure Serpent, and resting idly. These were the things that filled his days, of course. Other things were happening on the dark island. As well, Imp was still busy devouring the bands of tarnished silver that encased the black turtle's body. His progress was slow, but the gluttonous goblin seemed beyond himself with delight. His scrawny figure could often be seen sprawled on the black rocks, utterly engorged. The sin of solace was still there, following Sunny like a jaded wraith. Its litany of snide comments and contemptuous remarks never lessened, slowly driving him mad. Sunny endured as best as he could, and luckily, the spirit of the cursed sword wasn't nearly as talkative as it had been before. Nevertheless, the apparition put him in many awkward situations with Nephis. Nightmare was slowly subjugating new dreams into his unseen army, almost every night. The counter of the dream curse would go up by at least 1 or 2. The source of these defeated nightmares were, of course, Sunny and Nephis. It seemed that their minds were still haunted by the events of the past. Or maybe it was just the nature of the tomb of Ariel. Despite its breathtaking facade, it was a land worthy of its architect. A land of dread. It was also as desolate and empty as it was beautiful. Every day, Sunny and Nephis would study the northern horizon, hoping to see the signs of land, or anything at all, far in the distance. But each time, all that met them was an endless expanse of flowing water. Their hunger slowly grew. Although masters were much more resilient than mundane humans, they were still the same. They needed sustenance to survive, just like any human would. Their bodies were still strong, but they would start to wither before too long. Before that happened, Sunny and Nephis were going to have to find a way to harvest some of the black turtle's meat. The Azure Serpent raised its head from the water every time it devoured more, as if to mock them. "Ah, I am hungry." Sunny was sitting on a luxurious wooden chair, which was positioned near the slopes of the black turtle's carapace. Facing north, his shadows surrounded him, lazily sprawled on the black rocks and enjoying the dreamlike vista of the great river. Only the naughty one had wandered off to enjoy the view of Nephis training instead, dismissing the estuary key. Sunny rubbed his temples and stretched his legs.
I don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't recognize any of these weave elements, not even their vague purpose. The more I look at it, the more sure I am that it won't be, created by me.
Whoever had created the key of the estuary was a far greater sorcerer than Sunny was, or could ever dream to be. At least that was how it seemed.
All right, that's enough for today. The old snake should be showing its ugly mug any minute now. I really hope that it's as tired of staring at me as I am tired of staring at it.
Sunny glanced at the wide patch of bloody water surrounding the shell of the great turtle in anticipation, lingered for a few moments, and then frowned. Something was wrong with that picture. He stared at the water for a while, his scowl deepening. Then, Sunny slowly raised his eyes and looked at the sky. His pupils widened slightly. There, in the boundless blue expanse, far away, a black dot had appeared at some point. There was a black dot in the sky, far in the distance, slowly moving in the direction of the dark island. At first, Sunny felt a glimmer of hope ignite in his heart as he remembered a similar situation from the past. That time, it had turned out to be Kai, but this time, his intuition was ringing alarm bells, and a cold feeling of dread crept from somewhere to grip him with icy claws. Crap. Sitting on the shadow chair with his legs crossed, Sunny leaned back and sighed. With that, he exploded with a flurry of activity. First, Sunny dismissed his precious chair and dashed toward the middle of the island. At the same time, he sent a mental command to Saint. Nephis and she were currently engaged in a furious sword fight. Light and darkness were intertwined in a shimmering whirlpool of sharp steel, and the graceful knight's onyx figure was starkly contrasted against the rippling white tunic and alabaster skin of her slender opponent. Following Sunny's order, Saint froze. The tip of Neph's sword stopped a split second later, hovering millimeters away from the slit of her visor. Nephis frowned, then retracted her sword and looked around. There was a shadow on a rock outcropping that protruded from the ground a few meters away. It seemed to belong to a young man, and was currently waving its arms in the air while pointing at the sky. That's done. She swiftly turned around and looked up, then dashed away a moment later, running as fast as he could. Sunny leaped over a murky puddle of water and landed near a half-eaten fragment of tarnished silver. The scrawny figure of Imp could be seen nearby, laying on the ground with a blissful smile on his fiendish face. His hands were rubbing his ballooning belly with delight. "Stand up, buddy," Sunny shouted. The gluttonous goblin opened his eyes and stared at Sunny in confusion, then awkwardly tried to rise to his feet, however, outweighed by his full stomach. Imp lost his balance and promptly plopped back down. "We don't have time for this," Sonny yelled. Sonny leaned down, grabbed the weakly struggling fiend, and hoisted him on his shoulder. What the hell? Just how much had the little bastard swallowed up? Even with the strength of an ascended tyrant, Sonny was struggling to carry Imp. His veins swelled, and a befuddled expression appeared on his face, commanding the shadows to wrap themselves around his body. He grunted and continued to run. A dozen seconds later, Sonny reached the edge of the familiar fissure and unceremoniously tossed the little fiend down. Then, he threw one more look at the sky and, noticing that the black dot had already drawn nearer, jumped into the deep ravine himself. Before too long, Nephis and he were side by side, pressing themselves into the weathered slope of the fissure as they desperately tried to calm down their breathing. Saint and fiend were nearby, the former standing calmly, the latter hugging Sonny's thigh. Nightmare was there as well, hiding within the deep darkness enveloping the bottom of the gorge in his shadow form. Lastly, a beautiful amphora of white clay was standing on the ground in front of them, its surface decorated with mesmerizing patterns. It was another one of the memories Summer Night had given to Nephis, and its purpose was to mask their presence. Gods only knew if the amphora was going to work or not. Out of Sonny's 5 shadows, one had to volunteer to leave its area of effect and serve as a scout. Though, well, perhaps volunteer was the wrong word, since the gloomy shadow had performed a few dangerous tasks recently. And the happy fool wasn't someone Sonny would ever entrust an important matter to. The next in seniority had to go, so the creepy guy was currently hiding a few meters away from the edge of the fissure, staring creepily at the sky. The Sin of Solace was keeping it company with a bored expression on his face. The sparks swirling around Sonny's hand formed into an emerald flute, and he covered them with a dome of silence. Then, he let out a shaky breath.
I see it.
Nephis looked at him intently, then asked in a low voice, "What's it?" Sonny lingered for a few moments. Slowly, his expression turned grim. "It's a butterfly." Slowly, his expression turned grim. Indeed, a butterfly was descending toward the island. From afar, it seemed like an ethereal and beautiful creature. But as it drew closer, Sonny couldn't help but shiver. The butterfly's wings and back were black, but its body and underbelly were the color of white bone. It had 6 long, seemingly fragile legs that ended in sharp points, and 2 enormous, faceted eyes that were like orbs of pure darkness. Between them was a disturbingly long, oily black beak, which was currently bent into a spiral like an elephant's trunk. 2 antennae rose from its head, pushed back by the current of the wind. Apart from that, the butterfly was at least 100 meters in size. It was both exquisitely beautiful and deeply revolting, but most of all, it was deeply frightening. It's another great monster. Sonny gritted his teeth. His heart was beating rapidly in his chest, and his back was covered with cold sweat.
Great, and this is just great, and great, aha, it literally is.
By his side, Nephis scowled. What about? The monstrous butterfly was obviously intending to land on the island, but at that moment, the crimson water parted, and the Azure Serpent's scaled snout rose into the air, pierced by a mad gaze of its cloudy eyes. The great monster suddenly seemed wary. It moved its wings and altered the direction of its flight, circling the corpse of the black turtle from above instead of diving down to land on the black rock. The butterfly's huge eyes were aimed at the ancient serpent, and its antennae twitched rhythmically. This demented old snake. The great beast of the river bared its bloodied fangs and let out a furious roar, as if announcing its claim of the remains of the titanic turtle. Did the serpent not want to live? Why was it going around challenging great monsters? Am I really such a delicacy? Sonny didn't know what the giant butterfly was thinking, but one thing was certain. It didn't like that serpent's challenge. It didn't like it at all. Sonny described what was happening in a hushed voice. He didn't really need to whisper, considering that they were surrounded by a dome of silence. But it made him feel better, and what was happening appeared pretty clear. The monstrous butterfly had been attracted by the smell of blood and arrived to feast on the corpse of the black turtle that the Azure Serpent had so laboriously killed. The Azure Serpent, meanwhile, was having none of it, in fact. Judging by the madness burning in its eyes, The great beast was overcome with the bloody desire to rip the giant butterfly apart as well.
This thing really doesn't know what's good for it, H.
What was the reason for the Azure Serpent's reckless insolence? Humans often described nightmare creatures as mad, but that description wasn't entirely accurate. The abominations were indeed insane, but that didn't mean that they lacked sanity. Rather, it meant that their sanity was perverted, sinister, ineffable, and entirely different from what humans deemed sane. So why would the great beast risk its life fighting much more powerful monsters? Was it indeed madness? Was it pride? Was it reluctance to give up such an enormous prize? Or was it more reluctant to surrender two human souls that burned the flames of divinity to the stronger abomination? Whatever the reason was, the stubborn Leviathan seemed ready to battle the monstrous butterfly to the death. The butterfly let out an indescribable sound. The waters of the great river suddenly grew restless, rippling as they were assaulted by the powerful sonic waves. The serpent roared again, rising higher above the river's tumultuous surface.
I think they're going to fight.
Sonny wasn't sure what it meant for the two of them. He was belatedly happy about his decision to abandon the skies and seek shelter on the shell of the black turtle. If something like that butterfly had caught him in the air, he would have surely been dead in an instant. However, now that Nephis and he were trapped on the dark island, their fate seemed to be swaying on the edge of a perilous abyss. They were deeply unsure of their ability to slay a great beast. But a great monster was far more dreadful. They were only alive now because the Azure Serpent either lacked the ability or was reluctant to crawl out of the water. If the abominable butterfly won the battle, though nothing was going to stop it from doing just that, then their shelter would turn into a deadly trap. So, no matter how strange it sounded, Sonny had no choice but to root for the familiar great beast that had been staring at them hungrily for many days. Wishing to swallow them whole, the Azure Serpent had already killed one great monster. Maybe the mad snake would be able to pull off another miracle. Finally coming to a decision, the butterfly waved its wings and plummeted down, landing on the shell of the black turtle a moment later. The entire island shook from the devastating force of the impact. The creepy shadow remained motionless as it looked up at the 6 incredibly thin and long legs of the monster. The pale body of the butterfly was high above the ground, and its wings were open, covering a vast area in deep darkness. Now that it was closer, Sonny could see that it was covered in thick scales with white hairs growing between them. There was a complicated pattern on the creature's wings, as well, coalescing into a strange image, an image of. Sonny hurriedly commanded the shadow to look away as a strange certainty that he should never, ever try to look directly at the pattern covering the butterfly's wings flooded his mind. Sonny, what's happening? Damnation. He sucked in a shaky breath. They're just staring at each other. The butterfly shifted slightly, the sharp tips of its chitinous legs striking sparks from the black rock. Its trunk-like mouth slowly unfurled, turning into a fearsome black spear dozens of meters long. The abomination let out another harrowing screech, then suddenly struck the surface of the dead turtle's shell with its beak. 1, 2, 3 times, the island quaked, but not even a thin crack appeared on the rock. The butterfly froze for a moment, then twisted its head. Looking at the Azure Serpent, it seemed reluctant to go into the water.
Well, of course, one is a flying abomination and the other is a sea creature. The butterfly has to go into the water if it wants to gorge on the black turtle's meat, but that would mean fighting the Azure Serpent, and on the enemy's home ground, no less.
Maybe it would simply retreat, just as Sonny thought that. The butterfly suddenly folded its wings and lunged forward. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a deafening sonic boom and a harrowing black and white blur that suddenly shot toward the serpent like a gigantic javelin. A hurricane gale rose from the confounding fury of the great monster's lunge. It's attacking. A split second later, an enormous pillar of foaming crimson water rose into the sky. The serpent seemed to have managed to avoid the abominable butterfly's obliterating charge. However, its sharp legs tore at the sea creature's azure body. They're fighting. Nephis remained silent for a few moments, then gave him a strange look.
Sonny, where are they fighting in relation to our position?
He stared at her in confusion, then said,
Below water, to the left of the turtle's tail.
She lingered a bit, then took a deep breath.
Then they're on the opposite side from the turtle's head, where the entry wound is, so, while the serpent is preoccupied, shall we dive down and harvest some meat?
He opened his mouth, startled, then he slowly closed it again. Damn, I said it again.
Dive down, harvest meat. Are you crazy?
Nephis looked at him very seriously and shook her head.
No, I am not crazy. I am hungry.
What they were trying to do did, indeed, seem a little crazy. There were two great abominations fighting on one side of the black turtle, and Nephis wanted to dive into the water on the other side to steal some of the turtle's meat, because she was hungry, but, of course, it was really not that unhinged of a plan. She hadn't suggested it out of a burning desire to satiate her belly. Rather, it was out of necessity. The longer they were to go hungry, the weaker they would become. The weaker they became, the slimmer their chances of survival would be. Neither Nephis nor Sonny knew if they would get a better chance to harvest the black turtle's meat than now, when the Azure Serpent was distracted. In fact, they didn't even know if they would live long enough to enjoy the fruits of this perilous decision. If the monstrous butterfly won, they would probably die soon. But there was nothing they could really do about that, so the only thing they could do was prepare for the other outcome to the best of their ability. Grimacing, Sonny looked away and shook Imp off his thigh. Curses. Then he gritted his teeth and started climbing out of the fissure.
Hungry, she's hungry, hungry is she. Oh, just what sin did I commit in my past life to be cursed with all these gluttonous women?
Oblivious to his heartfelt plea, Nephis followed. It took Sonny just a few moments to scale the vertical slope of the deep fissure and climb onto the quaking surface of the dark island. It was shaking and swaying, pushed by the harrowing fury of the unseen battle that was happening below the waves. A split second later, Saint landed nearby, and a vast shadow crawled from the darkness to take the shape of a tenebrous steed. Neph arrived last. Slowed down a little by the need to carry the fragile amphora in one of her hands, Imp had been left in the relative safety of the fissure, since he was of no use in the current situation. Sonny and Nephis glanced at each other, and then broke into a sprint without having to say anything. Their goal was the end of the island beneath which the black turtle's enormous head was floating in the crimson water. It was also where the Azure Serpent had broken through the great monster's silver armor and burrowed into its flesh, leaving behind a gaping wound. Since the scales of the creature were all but impervious, the meat could only be harvested from inside such a spot. As they were nearing the point where the shell of the black turtle started to slope down at a steep angle, Sonny sighed and dismissed the shroud of dusk, left in just his underwear. He ignored Neph's strange gaze and summoned the nimble catch and the essence pearl instead.
I've traded a couple of memories just for such an occasion from the House of Night.
She lingered for a moment, then looked away, while the nimble catch was weaving itself from the sparks of light. Sonny threw a glance at his body and frowned a little. He had always been lean, and while his muscles simply refused to gain bulk, they had been like taut steel wire cables ever since the Forgotten Shore. Now, however, they had become a little bit too sculpted and defined. His abs were really like a washboard, which wasn't good at all. He had lost a lot of weight during the hellish journey through the nightmare desert and the days of hunger on the carcass of the black turtle. His body was all skin and muscle, with no fat left, which meant that it would start to devour itself next. Some men strived for such a physique, but for Sonny, who had grown up in the outskirts, it was a worrying sign.
We really need to get that, mate.
As the strange garb woven out of a fisherman's net covered his pale skin, he noticed that Nephis was giving him a sideways glance again. For some reason, slightly confused, he started to say, "Summon that." But he didn't have to say anything. The familiar golden rope was already manifesting in her hands. They needed to dive into the tumultuous red water to harvest the monster's meat, but they didn't have to be stupid about it if something happened. Sunny could swiftly pull them away through the shadows. However, finding a proper shadow to dive into was hard underwater, and since the great river was in the throes of the battle between the Azure Serpent and the monstrous butterfly, its current could easily pull Sunny and Nephis apart. She threw him one end of the golden rope, and he hastily tied it around his left wrist while she tied the other end around her right. At the same time, light swirled around Neph's slender legs and formed into two silver anklets. Sunny stared at them in confusion for a moment before realizing that their function had to be similar to the nimble catch. He was a bit envious. Hers wasn't an armor-type memory, so she didn't have to dismiss the white tunic.
I want to be sponsored by a Guiltythree saint too.
Holding the black bow, Saint took a position that gave her a perfect view of the head of the dead monster and the seething water surrounding it. Her task was to protect, or at least try to protect them should either the serpent or the butterfly arrive. Nightmares couldn't help her in case the former showed up, but if the latter did, his speed would have to assist Saint in leading the butterfly away. The amphora was placed beside them. Sunny and Nephis looked at each other one last time, then dashed forward and simultaneously jumped. The wind whistled in his ears. A few moments later, Sunny hit the crimson water and was instantly swallowed by it. It was like he had dove into a sea of blood. Everything around him was murky and red. Despite his best efforts, Sunny was momentarily disoriented, but regained his bearings after feeling a sharp tug on the golden rope. He found Neph through shadow sense and followed her as she swam forward with purpose. We need to be fast. She had already done this once. After all, granted, there hadn't been two great nightmare creatures creating a storm nearby at that time. Breathing with the help of the essence pearl, Sunny swam through the crimson waters of the great river. Guided by a golden rope that glowed faintly into the red murkiness, Sunny swam forward. The waters of the river of time, mixed with the crimson blood of a great monster, were cold and tumultuous. The battle of two harrowing abominations had turned them into a whirlpool of raging currents. Just how far is this wound? Suddenly, Sunny saw something enormous appear from the murky red darkness and shuddered. He was swimming past the giant eye of the titanic turtle, now hollow and devoid of light. His figure was like a speck of dust in front of it. The Azure Serpent had long feasted on the black turtle's left eye, but the right still remained, even though Sunny knew that the ancient behemoth was dead. He couldn't help but feel as if it was staring at him. Looking away, he pushed himself through the water.
We're not far from the creature's neck, then.
Every second could be their last, so Sunny was tense. The battle of the dreadful abominations could shift in their direction at any moment. More than that, the nimble catch allowed him to swim with great speed, and Neph's silver anklets were the same. However, she didn't seem to possess a memory similar to the essence pearl and had to hold her breath. They simply couldn't linger. Fortunately, the dark thoroughfare of the turtle's enormous neck emerged from the cloudy redness soon. It was encased in massive bands of tarnished silver, which overlapped to form a flexible but impenetrable armor. Sunny caught up with Nephis as they followed the road of silver to the point where the monster's neck ended. There, its armor was torn apart and bent, sharp, jagged edges surrounded by bloody foam. The stench of blood was much stronger here, and the water was much darker. Nephis changed her direction, knowing where to go. A dozen seconds later, they reached the gaping wound in the body of the great monster. Sunny froze for a moment. The Azure Serpent hadn't just ripped a chunk of flesh out of the black turtle's flesh. It actually burrowed inside like a hungry worm, tore through the insides of the monster, and then crawled out from a similar wound under one of the creature's flippers. As a result, the wound in front of them was like a dark tunnel, not too different from the one through which he had guided the convoy of refugees in the Antarctica Center. The scale of it was humbling.
I actually said that I can kill that damned snake, didn't I?
Nephis tugged on the rope to get his attention, then pointed forward, struggling against unexplainable fear. Sunny reluctantly pushed himself in that direction. At that moment, the entire corpse of the black turtle tilted, impacted by the shockwave of the terrifying clash between the Azure Serpent and the invading butterfly. It swayed slowly, and the dark tunnel of the harrowing wound started to move up. By the time they reached it, half of the gaping bloody hole was above the surface of the water, while the other half was still submerged in it. A red current was flowing out, trying to push them away. Sunny gritted his teeth and struggled against the flow, eventually entering the dark tunnel. Crap! Then, however, the current was reversed, and a great amount of water flowed into the body of the dead monster, pulling them deeper inside. Sunny was carried into the depths of the black turtle's corpse with dire speed, slamming against its flesh and holding tightly to the golden rope. After what felt like an eternity, the current grew weak, and he managed to climb onto something solid. Sunny pulled on the rope, and a second later, Nephis appeared from the water as well. She raised her hand, igniting a wisp of white flame on it to illuminate their surroundings. He took a deep breath, suddenly realizing how close the two of them were standing. After taking a bath in the diluted blood of the black turtle, both looked like a horror show, however. Sunny couldn't help but notice how tightly Neph's wet tunic stuck to her body, and how close to transparent the light fabric became. He shifted slightly, then forcibly tore his gaze away and studied the dark tunnel of the great monster's bleeding flesh. It looked exactly like one would imagine such a place to look. Not that people had reasons to try and imagine something so morbidly bizarre. The walls of the tunnel, which was mostly consumed by darkness, were uneven, spongy, and red. The lower half of it was covered by tumultuous water, while the upper half was filled with an almost unbearable stench of blood. Rivers of red were flowing from the walls and the ceiling, mixing with the dark water below. Sunny and Nephis were standing on one of the vertebrae of the black turtle, which protruded from the bottom of the tunnel like a pale pink mountain. While he was looking around, she was breathing heavily. So, now. Before he could finish the sentence, the carcass of the great monster quaked once again, and the two of them were almost thrown off the slippery bone. Sunny had to grab Nephis to prevent her from plummeting back into the seething water. A moment later, he realized that they were embracing, their bodies pressed tightly against each other. He could feel the softness and the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of the white tunic. Her striking gray eyes were close, too close, as well. Forgetting what he was going to say, Sunny remained motionless for a few moments. Then, he made sure that Nephis had regained her balance and carefully let her go.
So now all we have to do is carve some meat, right?
She cleared her throat, then raised the wisp of flame higher and looked away. Right, and return alive. Sunny let out a shaky breath. Sure, one thing at a time.